The handcuffs bit into her wrists. As Officer Dale Merritt shoved her face wall of Mercy Hollow's emergency room and adrenaline, and every nurse, doctor, and patient in that corridor went silent. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she turned her head, just enough to look at him over her shoulder calm, measured, almost bored, and said quietly, "You're going to want to take those off." Merritt laughed. His partner laughed. The charge nurse behind the desk looked away. Nobody in that building knew that the woman they were about to destroy in public had once carried wounded soldiers out of places that don't appear on any map. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where I want you. Follow this channel, so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started the way most of Lena Marsh's Tuesday. Shift started a drunk man in Bay 4, claiming his arm wasn't broken despite the bone visibly pressing against his skin. A teenager in Bay 7, who had swallowed something she wouldn't name in front of her mother, and a broken IV pump that maintenance had promised to fix since the previous Thursday. Lena had already replaced the pump herself using a parts kit she kept in her locker, resplinted the drunk man's arm with more patience than the situation deserved, and quietly talked the teenager into telling her mother the truth. Before the talk screen made the conversation unavoidable. That was how Lena Marsh operated, quietly, efficiently, drawing attention to herself. She was 31 years old, and she had worked at Mercy Hollow General Hospital in Dunmore, Kentucky, for 2 years and 4 months. She was the nurse the other nurses called when a patient was deteriorating faster than the monitors were showing. She was the one the residents flagged down when they needed someone to hold a situation together long enough for the attending to arrive. She had small hands, dark circles under her eyes that never fully went away, and she wore her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than she was. She didn't socialize much. She didn't talk about herself. She showed up early, stayed late, and never once asked for recognition. Nobody at Mercy Hollow General knew what Lena Marsh had been before she walked through their doors. She preferred it that way. It was 7:20 in the morning when she passed the administrator's hallway on her way to retrieve a chart from the nursing station and noticed the door to Richard Calloway's office standing open. That was unusual. Calloway, the hospital's chief operating administrator, typically kept that door closed and locked even when he was inside. Lena slowed without meaning to through the gap. She could see Calloway seated at his desk, speaking in a low voice to a man in a gray jacket she didn't recognize. The man had his back to the door. On the desk between them sat a small cardboard box that looked medical supply standard. Anna kept walking. She told herself it was none of her business. She was right. For about 40 more minutes, at 8 o'clock, the hospital's pharmacy liaison, a careful young woman named Priya Soul, who had worked the overnight shift, stopped Lena in the corridor outside the medication room. Priya's face was doing something complicated, hovering between alarm and uncertainty. The expression of someone who had seen something they couldn't immediately explain and were trying to decide whether to say it out loud. Priya said, "Can I ask you something weird?" "Sure," Lena said, already scanning the chart she was holding. "Did you sign out any Schedule 2 medications last night after midnight?" Anna looked up from the chart. "No, I had the 2 to 10 shift yesterday. I was gone before midnight." Priya nodded slowly. "Right. That's what I thought." Why? Priya glanced down the corridor both ways before answering. "There's a discrepancy in the overnight count, about 40 milligrams of oxycodone, documented as signed out by." She paused. "You." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. "That's not possible," Lena said. "I know, that's why I'm telling you before I file the report." I wanted to make sure it wasn't a data entry error before I filed the report," Lena said. "Do it now, don't wait." "If I do that, there's going to be an investigation." Lena said again, and something in her voice made Priya stop arguing. I filed the report at 8:14. By 8:42, things had happened. Richard Calloway had been notified, and hospital security had been contacted. At 9 o'clock, Lena Marsh was standing in the administrator's office across from the man she had watched through the cracked door 40 minutes earlier, except now she could see his face. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a complexion that suggested he spent more time outdoors than most hospital administrators did. His name, Calloway told her, was Gerald Fitch, and he was the hospital's new compliance consultant. Lena had never heard of him before this moment. "We've pulled the medication log," Calloway said, not looking at her directly. He had a habit of angling his chair slightly away from whoever he was speaking to, as if proximity made him uncomfortable. "There's a record of a controlled substance withdrawal that occurred at 12:47 this morning." Authorized under your credentials. Credentials were used, Lena said. I didn't use them. 5. The system shows your ID badge was scanned. Someone else used my badge, or the system was manipulated. 5. I wasn't here at 12:47. I can give you my departure time from the parking garage. There's a card reader log. Calloway glanced at Fitch. Something passed between them that Lena couldn't fully read. We'd also like to look at your locker, Calloway said. Anna went still. Not visibly, she had been trained past the point where her face betrayed much of anything in high-pressure moments. Internally, she felt something sharpen and go cold. Why? She asked, standard protocol in a controlled substance discrepancy. Your compliance consultant is here. Has the pharmacy director been notified? Has HR been contacted? What's the formal procedure you're following? Because I want to make sure we're doing this correctly. Calloway's jaw tightened. I'm not refusing, she said. I'm asking what the procedure is. Because you said standard protocol, and I want to make sure we're following standard protocol. Fitch spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth in a way that didn't match his appearance. Locker check is standard. The sooner we clear this up, the better for everyone. Ina looked at him steadily. Sure, she said, let's go. They walked to the staff locker room together. Calloway, Fitch, and a hospital security officer named Dunn, who had the uncomfortable body language of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Locker was number 14. She opened it herself. Dunn reached in and shifted a folded set of spare scrubs. Behind them was a small, sealed pharmaceutical bag. Ina stared at it. She knew in the way that people who have spent time in genuinely dangerous situations recognize the shape of a trap exactly what she was looking at. That's not mine, she said. Miss Marsh, Calloway began. I want that bag photographed where it is before it's touched. I want a custody documentation started right now. I want the security footage from this hallway for the past 24 hours pulled immediately. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Fitch said. Someone planted that, Lena said. Ice didn't rise. It didn't shake. Who had worked in operating rooms or combat zones or situations where panic was a luxury nobody could afford. They developed it. Not certain. Unnervingly calm. And whatever is in that bag is evidence of a crime, which means if you touch it without documentation, you've just compromised your own case. Photograph it. Calloway made a decision in his face, calculation running behind his eyes and landing somewhere she didn't like. I think we need to pause your duties pending investigation, he said. You're suspending me pending investigation. It's often protocol, she said. Right. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she took her personal items from the top shelf of the locker, phone, her water bottle, her car keys, and she walked out of the locker room with the same unhurried stride she'd walked in with. What she didn't do was go to the parking garage. Lena went to the ER break room, sat down with a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want, and spent 11 minutes thinking, not panicking, not spiraling thinking. She knew she hadn't signed out any medication. She knew she hadn't been in the building at 12:47. She knew the bag in her locker hadn't been there yesterday morning, when she'd retrieved her stethoscope at the start of her shift, which meant someone had placed it there between then and now. The list of people who had accessed that locker room was not infinite. The badge readers logged every entry. She also knew that Calloway had looked at Fitch, a man who had no visible reason to be in that office this morning, before answering any of her procedural questions. That was interesting. She pulled out off and sent a text to a number that most people in her life didn't know existed. The message was short. It said only, might need a favor. Can you check a name? Fitch, Science Consultant, Mercy Hollow General, on more K. Asked. The reply came back in 4 minutes on it. Stay calm. Ina drank her coffee and watched the break room door. She had been out of the military for 3 years. She had spent those 3 years deliberately building a life that looked nothing like what had come before it. A steady job, a small apartment, a routine that didn't involve anyone shooting at her. She had not told her coworkers about her service. She had not told her supervisors. The few times patients had asked about a scar on her forearm, she had said car accident and moved on. She had worked very hard to be ordinary. He was about to find out how well that had worked. At 10:15, 2 things happened in close enough succession that they felt choreographed. Offers. The first was that Officer Dale Merritt of the Dunmore Police Department arrived at the hospital with his partner, Officer Connie Foss, in response to a call Calloway's office had apparently placed, not to hospital security but directly to the police. Controlled substance theft was a criminal matter. Calloway had decided he wasn't waiting for an internal investigation. The second thing was that Lena's phone buzzed with a message from the number she'd texted. It said Fitch isn't a compliance consultant. His real name is Gerald Pratt. 5. He has a contractor's license tied to a logistics company called Harrow Supply. Does that name mean anything to you? Lena looked at the message for exactly 2 seconds before pocketing her phone and standing up. Harrow Supply. She had heard that name once, a month ago, in a conversation she hadn't been meant to overhear between Calloway and a man in the parking structure near the building's north entrance. 5. She had been coming off a shift not paying particular attention, and the name had registered and then filed itself away, the way her brain tended to file things she didn't yet have context for. Harrow Supply medical-grade logistics. Calloway's voice had been lower than usual. 5. She walked out of the break room and back toward the emergency department. 5. Merritt and Foss were already there. Merritt was a tall man with the build of someone who had played football in high school and never quite adjusted to no longer being the largest person in any given room. 5. He was speaking to the charge nurse at the main desk with a familiarity that told Lena he was a regular presence here. Not in an emergency capacity, but in whatever capacity cops became regular presences in hospital hallways. Foss stood slightly behind him, clipboard visible expression professionally neutral. Lena identified herself before either of them could speak. I'm Lena Marsh. I assume you're here about me. Merritt turned and looked her over in that particular way. Not hostile yet, just assessing placing her in a category before he'd asked a single question. Faced it. She'd seen it her whole adult life. A woman, soft-spoken, no visible threat indicators. Category assigned. Expectation calibrated accordingly. Marsh. He clicked his pen. Mr. Calloway has filed a report alleging theft of controlled substances. I need to ask you some questions. I'm happy to answer questions, Lena said. I'd like it noted for the record that I have already requested chain of custody documentation for the item found in my locker, and I have asked that surveillance footage for the locker room hallway be preserved. That's been done. Merritt blinked. It was a fast blink, the kind that happened when someone's prepared script ran into an unexpected response. We'll be conducting the investigation, I understand. I'm asking whether the hospital has preserved the footage. Because if it gets overwritten before you request it, that's a problem for both of us. Us made a note on her clipboard. That was something at least. Why don't we step somewhere private? Merritt said. And it wasn't a question. They moved to a consultation room off the main ER corridor, one of the small windowless rooms typically used for delivering difficult news to families. Merritt took the chair across the table from Lena. Us remained standing near the door. Calloway was not present, but Gerald Fitch was safe. He'd positioned himself in the corner of the room, arms folded in a way that suggested observer, but registered more clearly as overseer. Lena did not look at Fitch again after she'd noted his presence. She directed her attention entirely to Merritt. Walk me through yesterday, Merritt said. She did precisely. Her shift start time, her patient load, her break, her departure from the building, her badge out time at the parking garage card reader. She had a good memory, better than most people. She could reconstruct sequences of events with a specificity that sometimes unnerved people who weren't expecting it. Merritt took notes, but his posture was already telling her what his conclusion was going to be before he'd finished hearing her out. He'd made the category assessment at the desk, and the subsequent information was being filtered through it. Body language was the giveaway. Slightly leaned back, moving slower than it needed to. The quiet condescension of a man who had already decided he was not dealing with someone who required careful attention. Here's the problem, Merritt said when she finished. We have a medication discrepancy. We have your credentials on the withdrawal log. We have a controlled substance owned in your assigned locker. He paused. That's a lot of coincidence to explain away. It's also a lot of coincidence for a random theft, Lena said. Someone would have had to access the medication log system with my credentials, physically enter the medication room, remove the substance, enter the locker room, and place the bag in my specific locker. That's not a crime of opportunity. That's deliberate. Why would someone do that to you? Lena held his gaze. I'd like to know the answer to that myself. Fitch shifted in the corner. Just enough, Ms. Marsh, Merritt said. We're going to need you to come with us. I'm being arrested. You're being asked to come in for further questioning. Those are different things. If I'm not being arrested, I have the right to decline and contact legal representation first. If I am being arrested, I want the arrest clearly stated. Touch is cited. And I want to make a phone call. The room got quiet in a specific way that rooms get quiet when someone who is expected to fold doesn't. Merritt stood up. His chair scraped back. He was using height deliberately now, which told her the conversation had moved past its professional phase. I'd recommend not making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making it hard, Lena said. I'm making it accurate. There's a difference. What happened next happened fast. Merritt moved around the table. Not to escort her, she realized immediately, but to grab her arm and walk her out before she could say anything else in front of Fass's clipboard. It was the kind of move that worked on people who were caught off guard by physical authority. Her arm. He started moving. Lena planted her feet. She didn't twist away. She didn't raise her hands. She just stopped moving in a way that made him have to actually pull, and the effort that required someone her size, with his size, was enough to make Foss look up sharply from the clipboard. Officer Merritt, Lena said quietly and very clearly, you are about to use unnecessary force on an individual who has not resisted lawful arrest and has not been formally charged. I want you to think carefully about the next 30 seconds. You think this is a game? He tightened his grip. His other hand came up and pushed her toward the wall. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to send a message. Her shoulder connected with the cinder block. She could have ended it. Every training instinct she'd spent years acquiring knew exactly what to do with someone grabbing her from behind, how to break the grip, how to use his own momentum, how to put him on the floor in under 3 seconds without injuring him severely. As every single reflex. Said go she didn't. She stood against the wall and looked at Fass. Fass was writing something quickly. You're making a mistake, Lena said to Merritt. Not about me. About whoever told you to come here this morning. You should ask yourself who benefits from me being removed from this building right now. Merritt pulled her arms behind her back. The cuffs were on before she finished the sentence. They walked her through the emergency department. This was deliberate. The consultation room connected to the ER corridor, and Merritt chose that route over the staff hallway that led to the parking exit. He walked her through the main floor, past the bay where the drunk man's arm had been set 2 hours ago, past the nursing station, where 3 colleagues Lena knew by name were standing with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. Reyes, a nurse she'd worked alongside for 2 years, stepped forward. Lena. Don't, Merritt said. It's okay, Tomas, Lena said. Dr. Perral, tell her what's happening. Ask her to contact compliance and make sure the surveillance request hasn't been canceled. Merritt jerked her arm. That's enough. The medication log should show a timestamp, she continued loud enough now that the corridor could hear her. Ask the pharmacy for the raw access data, not the summary report. Data will show. Merritt pushed her through the double doors and into the ambulance bay, and the doors swung shut behind them, and Lena went quiet. She stood in the ambulance bay with her hands cuffed behind her, morning light cutting across the concrete, and she breathed carefully in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she'd learned to breathe in places that were considerably worse than this. She had bought a few minutes. She hoped it was enough. It wasn't enough. They put her in the back of Merritt's patrol car at 10:42. Watched from the ambulance bay entrance, with his arms still folded and his face giving away nothing. Chloe was not visible. The patrol car pulled out of the hospital lot and onto the access road, and Lena sat in the seat and let her mind work. The text from her contact had said Harrow Supply. She needed to know what Harrow Supply actually did, specifically what contracts it held, and whether any of those contracts connected to Mercy Hollow General's supply chain. She also needed to know when Fitch had arrived in Dunmore. And she needed the surveillance footage from the locker room hallway before it vanished. She had none of those things right now, but she knew people who could get them. The problem was the phone in her pocket, which she could not currently reach. They were 3 blocks from the hospital when Merritt's radio erupted. The voice on the other end was controlled in that specific way that dispatcher voices got controlled when the situation underneath was not controlled at all. Medical units in the Mercy Hollow general vicinity be advised reports of a structural incident at the medical center parking structure north side. Multiple units requested. Merritt hit the brakes. He and Foss exchanged a look through the rearview mirror. And a report of a vehicle fire spreading toward the hospital's north wing fuel lines. Evacuation protocols being initiated, all available. Around, Fass said. Merritt was already turning around. The patrol car swung hard in the road, tires loud against asphalt, and Lena set herself against the back seat and looked through the rear window toward the hospital. A column of black smoke was rising above the tree line, thick and fast-moving, the kind of column that didn't come from a small fire. It came from something already feeding itself. Her stomach tightened. A parking structure north side. She knew what was in the north side of that parking structure. She had walked past it 100 times. Hospitals, auxiliary generator systems, the backup power grid that kept the trauma wing and operating suites running during outages were housed in a utility corridor that connected the structure's ground level to the hospital's north wing. The fuel lines ran along the outside of that corridor. Lines. If those lines went up, the trauma wing would lose power. The backup generators would be compromised. The surgical suites would go dark, now at 10:44. On a Tuesday morning, the trauma wing was occupied. The patrol car hit the hospital driveway at high speed, and Merritt was already on the radio calling it in, and Feast was calling it in on her phone simultaneously, and through the windshield, Lena could see people streaming out of the hospital's main entrance. Some of them in gowns, some of them still attached to portable equipment, nurses trying to organize a mass of people who hadn't been trained for an evacuation and weren't responding to instructions. They could barely hear over the noise. The car stopped. Doors open, neither officer thought about the handcuffs. Lena did not wait to see what they were going to do. She was out of the car the moment Merritt opened the rear door. Not running, but moving with a purpose that cut through the crowd instinctively, people parting around her without knowing why. Something in her posture and her pace registering at a level below conscious thought. Her hands were still cuffed behind her, which meant she was navigating by shoulder and body positioning, keeping her balance shifted forward, scanning the evacuation line with eyes that were doing an automatic rapid assessment of who was mobile, who wasn't the exit bottleneck points were, where the crowd pressure would build. There were two bottlenecks already forming. The main entrance ramp, where a motorized wheelchair had stalled against the handrail, blocking half the exit width, and the side door near Bay 3, which had defaulted to locked in the evacuation protocol, even though half the hospital's ambulatory patients were trying to push through it. Merritt, she called, not turning around. He was behind her somewhere. She swear the side door on Bay 3. It's locked on the emergency protocol and people can't get out. Override it from the security panel at the nurse's station or break the glass. Someone is going to get crushed against that door. There was a pause, then she heard him moving. She got to the wheelchair blockage first. And an elderly man, oxygen, tank still running, had tried to navigate the ramp, and the front wheel had caught the handrail's lower guard at an angle that had locked it in place. He was pulling at the joystick and getting nowhere, and the people behind him were pressing forward because they couldn't see what was causing the slowdown. Pushing. Better, she said loudly, puffed over her shoulder. Line behind me. Everyone stopped moving for 15 seconds. It worked because the voice worked. Because some people in a crisis will follow the first instruction that sounds like it came from someone who knows what they're doing. She crouched awkward with her arms behind her and got a shoulder against the chair's frame, using her body weight to angle the front wheel off the guard. The chair released. The man rolled forward. The line started moving. She straightened up and kept moving, and behind her she heard the Bay 3 side door bang open, which meant Merritt had found the override, or someone had. She was almost at the main entrance when the second explosion hit. It was smaller than it sounded, concussive, rather than structural, the kind of secondary detonation that came from a pressurized line releasing rather than a primary blast. But it was loud enough to stop the evacuation in its tracks. People dropped. People screamed. The smoke column above the north wing doubled in thickness, and then someone inside the building started screaming. Not at the noise, but at something else, something happening on the hospital's interior. Lena went still for exactly 1 second and read the situation. Trauma wing. The power was going, she could hear it. Not the sound of it, but the absence of sound. Ambient electrical hum of a large building. The background noise that stopped being noticeable until it stopped entirely. It dropped section by section, north to south, and in the sudden relative quiet, she could hear someone inside the hospital shouting the thing she had already figured out. 3 is off backup. We have an open patient. She looked at her cuffed hands. She looked at the hospital entrance. She looked around for Foss, who was the one with the keys. Foss was 40 feet away, directing a group of patients in gowns toward the parking lot perimeter, back turned. There was no time to cross 40 feet and explain. Lena went into the hospital. Inside, the emergency lighting had kicked on, red-edged and insufficient, casting everything in the kind of light that made depths hard to read and faces hard to take. She moved through the main ER corridor, fast past the nursing station, where 2 nurses were frozen at the desk, staring at a monitor that had gone black. Past the supply alcove, where a crash cart sat unmoved, because the nurse who should have been moving it was standing in the hallway with both hands over her mouth. Take the crash cart to OR3, Lena said as she passed. The nurse's hands came down. She grabbed the cart handle. Lena kept moving. The trauma wing corridor was at the end of the north hallway, through a pair of heavy fire doors that required badge access except. The badge readers were down with the power, which meant the doors had defaulted to the unlocked position per code. which meant Lena could push through them with her shoulder, which she did. Left. 3 was the second room on the left. Through the small window in the OR door, she could see the surgical team in the red emergency light, 3 people, at least one patient on the table, the attending's hands, visible and moving, and the residents flanking him with flashlights, held at angles that were doing their best, but weren't enough. 5. She could see from the posture of the team that they were managing, but barely. They had a few more minutes before barely became not at all. She needed her hands. She turned and scanned the corridor. A mounted emergency equipment cabinet to her right. She had walked past it hundreds of times. She knew what was in it. She backed up to it, twisted, and got her cuffed hands on the cabinet latch. Opened. She did not look at what she was reaching for. She did it by contact. The trauma shears hanging on the left hook got them between her fingers, awkward, both hands, working against the cuff chain, and cut the zip tie securing the handle loop. The shears weren't going to cut the cuffs. That wasn't the plan. She turned back to OR3 and pushed through the door backward, shears in hand. Who needs these? She said. The attending, a man she'd seen in the cafeteria but never worked with, looked up. His name badge, said Dr. Ruben Okafor, and his eyes above his mask did a fast calculation. Who are you? Lena Marsh, 3rd floor. You have a patient on the table and no power. What do you need? Light, and I need... Why are you handcuffed? Long morning. Up to you. What do you need? Dr. Okafor beat one beat. And then he made the decision. The resident on my left is holding retraction on a bleeder. I can't see adequately. If you can get in there, and I can't reach with the cuffs. Give me the shears back and use them to cut the chain. I'm sterile. The resident isn't doing anything with their left hand except holding a light. Okafor looked at the resident Femi. The resident named Femi took the shears from Lena's fingers, worked them between the cuff links, and bore down. The chain was not designed to resist trauma shears applied with both hands and significant pressure. It took 4 attempts. On the 4th, the link separated and Lena's hands came apart. She had bruised wrists, half a handcuff on each wrist, and no sterile gloves. Gloves and a gown, she said. Someone handed them to her. She scrubbed as fast as she had ever scrubbed in her life. At the small sink in the corner, gowned, gloved, and moved to the table. What happened in the next 14 minutes in OR3 would later be the subject of a lot of conversation that Lena was not present for. What she knew in the moment was that Okafor was a surgeon working under genuinely terrible conditions, that the resident Femi was good but frightened, and that the patient, a man in his 60s, abdomen open, whose name she did not learn until much later, needed 2 specific things done in a specific order before Okafor could. The situation became something other than critical. She did the 2 things. She talked Femi through the light positioning. She watched Okafor's hands and anticipated what he needed before he asked for it. The power came back on at 11:17. When the overhead lights flickered and then held, Okafor exhaled through his nose in a long, controlled breath, and the tension in the room dropped by a measurable degree. All right, he said. We're closing. Lena stepped back from the table. Femi was staring at her with an expression she had seen before, the expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a situation. Where did you learn to do that? Femi asked. Nursing school, Lena said. She stripped her gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. She walked out of OR3 into the corridor, and she was standing there, hands at her sides, one cuff still hanging from each wrist, when she heard the sound from the direction of the hospital's main entrance. The sound of the fire. That had diminished in the past few minutes, which meant someone had gotten to the fuel lines before they fully compromised the structure. This was a different sound. Vehicles, multiple vehicles. Athens moving fast, and then stopping. She walked toward the sound. She came out through the fire doors into the air corridor, and she could see through the glass panels of the main entrance the parking lot outside, where 4 vehicles, 2 of them dark SUVs with no visible markings, one of them a state police cruiser, one of them a black sedan with government plates, had pulled up in a line and stopped, and people were getting out of them who did not look like EMTs or firefighters or local police. They looked like people who had come a significant distance in a significant hurry for a specific reason. Lena stopped walking. Merritt was at the entrance. She could see him through the glass, stopping the lead figure from the SUVs, a woman in a dark jacket, her credentials already extended. Merritt was talking. The woman was not. Then the woman said something, and Merritt took a step back. And the woman pushed through the hospital's entrance doors and came inside, and she was looking for someone, and her eyes crossed the corridor and found Lena, and she stopped. Lena Marsh? The woman said. Yes, Lena said. My name is Special Agent Dara Quinlan, FBI Field Operations. I need you to come with me right now. She paused, looking at the half-cuffs on Lena's wrists. and need someone to get those off of her immediately. Behind Quinlan, Merritt had come inside. His partner Foss was right behind him. They were both staring at Lena with expressions that had begun to shift from the earlier certainty into something that had no name yet. Something between confusion and the first very uncomfortable awareness that a calculation had gone very wrong. Right. She's being detained, Merritt said, alleged theft of mites. Oh, Quinlan said. She's not. She turned to look at him for the first time since entering, and it was a brief, complete, and absolutely final look. Whatever. You think you have on her, you don't. And if you interfere with what we're doing here in the next 4 hours, you're going to have a very bad week, officer. Often's Merritt's mouth opened. Quinlan repeated, as if she were discussing the weather. Right. She turned back to Lena. We need to talk, and you're going to want to hear what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to change what happens next considerably. On the corridor behind them, someone Lena couldn't see was shouting about the fire suppression system in the north wing, and whether it had engaged and whether the structural integrity of the parking level was compromised. Outside, the smoke was still rising, and somewhere deeper in the hospital, the patient in OR 3 was being wheeled to recovery. And at the nursing station, the charge nurse had just gotten off the phone with someone and turned to look at the scene unfolding in the corridor with wide eyes and a slack jaw. Ina pulled a sealed folder from inside her jacket and held it out. Ina took it. She didn't open it yet. She looked at Quinlan's face instead, the particular expression of someone delivering information they've been carrying for a while. The controlled tension around the eyes that said, "This is not a routine matter and has not been for some time." How long have you been watching Mercy Hollow, General? Lena asked. Quinn's expression shifted by a fraction. Long enough to know that whoever set you up this morning made a significant mistake. They had no idea who they were setting up. Quinlan glanced at the folder. Open it. Lena opened it. The first page was her own service record. The version that wasn't supposed to exist in accessible form. The version that included classifications that had been buried for 3 years under a series of administrative designations. She had requested specifically so that her civilian life could remain unconnected to what had come before it. Up there, every line, every deployment, every designation. Up. There are 3 people in that hospital, Quinlan said, who don't know what's actually in that building. Athens Gerald Pratt, who you know as Fitch, is one of them. Natured. Calloway is another, she paused. The third is the person who's been running the operation that Pratt is connected to. And that person is about to realize that what they did this morning has activated something they cannot shut back down. The smoke side was starting to thin. The hospital hummed with the sound of restored electricity and controlled emergency, and the kind of low chaos that hadn't yet resolved into anything permanent. Ina looked at the service record in her hands, the document that laid out in precise federal language exactly who she was and what she had done in places that didn't appear on any map, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not anger, not fear, clarity. All right, she said. Tell me everything. Quinlan did not take her to a conference room or an administrator's office or any of the places inside the hospital where conversations like this were supposed to happen. She took her outside to the far end of the ambulance bay where the vehicles from the government convoy had parked, away from the still active emergency response, away from the smoke and the personnel and the noise. One of the dark SUVs had its rear doors open. A man Lena hadn't noticed before was sitting inside with the laptop cables running to a portable router on the seat beside him. He looked up when they approached, said nothing, and looked back down. Leaned against the vehicle's frame and folded her arms. She said without preamble. You know the name. I heard it once. Parking structure conversation about a month ago. Walk away. And someone I didn't recognize. What you heard was probably a problem-solving conversation. Arrow has been contracted with Mercy Hollow General for 11 months. On paper, they provide pharmaceutical logistics inventory management, transport coordination, supply chain oversight. Practice. Quinlan paused, not for effect, but because she was deciding how much to give at once. Practice. They've been using the hospital's controlled substance ordering system as a pass-through. Diversion. For significant diversion. We're looking at a structured skimming operation. Medications are ordered at volume. A percentage is pulled before inventory logging, documentation is adjusted to match the reduced count, and the pulled supply moves through Harrow's secondary distribution network. She looked at Lena directly. Alway doesn't just know about it. He built the access for it. He restructured the pharmacy ordering protocols 18 months ago in a way that made the skimming window possible. We've been watching it since March. Lena turned that over. And why am I here? Why isn't this already in motion? Because the documentation trail we have establishes the operation but doesn't close it. 5. We need the actual transaction logs from Callaway's system access, the secondary Harrow invoicing that doesn't match the hospital's formal accounts. And the coordination communications between Callaway and Pratt Quinlan uncrossed her arms. 3 weeks ago, someone inside the hospital started pulling those records. Not all at once. Carefully, incrementally, in a way that didn't trigger the system monitoring Callaway's people had set up. Someone who knew how the internal record system worked, knew where to look, and knew how to access it without leaving the kind of footprint that shows up on a standard audit log. Ina was quiet for a moment. "You think it was me," she said. "We know it was you," Quinlan said. "We were watching the system access from our end. Saw it happening. We spent 2 weeks trying to figure out who it was. The access pattern was unusual. It didn't match staff-wide behavior. It wasn't sloppy enough to be accidental, and it was targeted in a way that suggested someone who understood what they were looking for before they started looking." She held Lena's gaze. "Then we pulled the employment file on Lena Marsh and ran it against the clearance system, and we got a flag we weren't expecting. The service record, 3 years buried, and a federal database query had surfaced it in under a minute." "What I was pulling," Lena said slowly, "was the medication access log discrepancies. I found the first one 6 weeks ago, a count that didn't add up. I went back through the records carefully over time the way you described, because I wanted to understand the pattern before I reported it. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Did you report it?" "I was about to. I was 2 days from having something coherent enough to take to the State Pharmaceutical Oversight Board, directly bypassing hospital administration." She looked at the hospital building across the lot. "And then this morning happened." Quinlan nodded slowly. "You were close. Someone in Callaway's orbit noticed the access pattern. Not what you were accessing, but the fact of the access. It was enough to spook them. So Callaway set me up to remove me before I could report, and to discredit anything you'd already found. If you're facing a controlled substance theft charge, any records you've gathered become suspect, and your credibility as a witness goes to zero." Quinlan's voice was flat, not editorializing. Just the mechanics of it laid out plainly. "It's not a bad play, honestly, if the target had actually been a civilian employee with no other resources." Ina looked at the service record still in her hand. "But I'm not." "You're not," Quinlan agreed, "which is the mistake they made." There was a pause while the man in the SUV murmured something into a headset, and the convoy's state police cruiser shifted position in the lot, moving closer to the hospital's north entrance. Anna registered both without looking directly at either. The fire had been contained. She could see that from the reduced smoke and the shift in emergency personnel posture from reactive to controlled. The structural damage would be assessed, but the immediate threat was over. Which meant Callaway was still inside and Pratt Fitch was still inside. "What do you need from me?" Lena asked. "The records you were compiling. Whatever you have, wherever you have it." "I was using an encrypted file archive. I set up through a personal account. It's accessible, but not on any hospital system. Good. We need that compiled with what our team has and formatted for a federal warrant application." Quinlan glanced toward the hospital entrance. "We also need you to walk me through the physical layout. Specifically the medication room access points, the secondary storage that Harrow has been using, and anything you know about Callaway's office setup." "I can do that. There's something else." "Fine." Waited. Gerald Pratt Fitch was in Callaway's office this morning, before any of this started. Box on the desk. I saw it from the hallway. She thought about the angle, the size, the way Pratt had been positioned relative to it. I don't know what was in it. But the timing, if Callaway and Pratt knew they were about to move on me, they may have also been moving something else, either securing it or removing it. Quinlan turned to the man in the SUV. "Fine." The man named Wren looked up. "Get eyes on Callaway's office interior if we have anything in position. Checking on it." Quinlan looked back at Lena. "In the meantime, I need you to understand something about the next few hours. What we're doing here is active. It's not a waiting game anymore. Your situation this morning forced a timeline. Callaway's team is going to figure out that the arrest didn't hold, and when they do, they're going to start moving. So we need to be faster than that, understood?" "Are you all right?" Quinlan asked it the way someone asked it who genuinely wanted an answer but didn't have time for a long one. Ina looked at her wrists. The bruising from the cuffs had darkened into something visible. Eyes. Her shoulder, where Merritt had pushed her into the wall, had a specific deep ache that told her the muscle had compressed against bone. She was running on coffee from 3 hours ago, and an amount of adrenaline that would leave a debt to be collected later. "I'm functional," she said. Quinlan accepted that. "Nice. Then let's go back inside. Merritt and Fess were still in the ER corridor when Lena came back through the entrance with Quinlan. Merritt had positioned himself with his arms crossed and his chin slightly elevated in a way that Lena recognized as the body language of someone maintaining a posture they were no longer fully confident in. Us was standing slightly apart from him, which was different from before. Merritt looked at Quinlan. I want to know what authority you're operating under here. Quinn handed him a document without slowing down. Federal Task Force authorization, co-signed by the Eastern District U.S. Attorney. You're welcome to call the number at the bottom. I'd suggest doing it from somewhere that isn't the middle of my scene, Merritt said. This is my jurisdiction. Einan stopped. She turned around with the patience of someone who had done this specific conversation before and found it exhausting every time. Officer Merritt. There is a federal investigation underway that predates whatever this morning was by 8 months. Nice. You and your department may have been contacted through channels that made this look like a straightforward controlled substance theft. I'm telling you right now that it was not, and that the call you received this morning almost certainly came through someone who knew that it would bring you here to do exactly what you did. She let that land for a moment. I'd recommend thinking carefully about who made that call and why. Was writing in her notebook again. Merritt's certainty had been eroding since the convoy arrived, and now it dropped another visible degree. The jaw was still set, but the eyes had shifted into something less comfortable. Lessons will be addressed, Quinlan said. All of it will be addressed. Right now I need you both to stay out of the north corridor, stay away from Calloway's office, and do not under any circumstances contact anyone in a hospital administration to tell them, we're here. She turned and kept walking. Lena followed. Behind them, Merritt said nothing. Was still writing. Calloway's office was in the hospital's administrative wing, set back from the main patient corridors along a hallway that connected to the facility's management section through a door most staff didn't use. Lena had been through it twice during her hospital orientation, once when she'd gone looking for the maintenance office about the broken IV pump. She knew the layout. She knew which offices shared walls where the corridor cameras were positioned, and that Calloway's office had a secondary door that opened into the adjacent conference room. Quinlan's agent, Wren, had in the time since they'd come back inside gotten remote access to the hospital's internal camera network through a cooperation agreement with the hospital's IT contractor, not Calloway's authorization, but the IT contractor's own federal compliance obligation. The camera covering the administrative hallway showed Calloway's office door closed. The camera outside the secondary conference room entrance showed the conference room door also closed. Safe. He's in there, Wren said, reading from his screen. Hasn't moved in 40 minutes. Pratt? Last captured on camera in the east stairwell about 20 minutes ago. Lost him after that. Lena looked at the camera feed over Wren's shoulder. Levels. The east stairwell connected to the basement level, which connected to the hospital's loading dock. Loading dock was where Harrow Supply's contracted delivery vehicles accessed the building. He's pulling something out, she said. The loading dock was already on her radio. 2 of the agents from the convoy were redirected. Lena looked at the map on Wren's screen, the hospital's internal floor plan that he'd pulled from somewhere in the past 40 minutes. She traced the basement route with one finger not touching the screen. There's a secondary pharmacy storage room at the B2 level. It's listed in the hospital's floor plan, a dry goods archive, but it was converted 2 years ago, and the conversion wasn't updated in the public-facing documentation. That room has its own exterior access point through the dock's left loading bay. Ian looked at her. How do you know about that room? I found it 3 weeks ago when I was trying to understand where the inventory discrepancy was originating. Walk the building, show me on the map, Lena pointed. Quinlan's radio was already in her hand. What happened in the next 4 minutes was fast enough that Lena only had partial visibility into pieces of it. John's team was well coordinated in the way of people who had rehearsed this specific type of operation, which told her the timing wasn't entirely improvised. They'd been preparing for this phase, and what had happened this morning had moved the clock forward without changing the fundamental plan. The agents who had been redirected to the loading dock area caught Gerald Pratt in the left loading bay with a rolling pharmaceutical cart and a Harrow Supply transit case that he had not been authorized to remove from the building. Pratt refused to identify the contents. He also refused to cooperate with the agent's request that he remain in place, which resulted in a short and ungainly sequence of events that ended with Pratt sitting on the loading dock floor, with his hands secured and his composure entirely gone. Lena wasn't there for that part. She heard about it from Wren 20 minutes later. eyes. She was at that moment sitting in the hospital's records room with a laptop Quinlan had provided, compiling the files she had been building for 3 weeks into a format the federal team's analysts could work with. Logs. The files were granular TAMS access logs, medication count discrepancies mapped against Harrow invoice dates, a pattern analysis she had built manually using nothing but the pharmacy's own internal reports and a notepad she'd been keeping in the locked glove compartment of her car. The analyst, who sat across from her, a young woman named Petra, who had barely said 10 words, looked up from the data as it transferred and said, "This is really well organized." "I had time," Lena said. Petra looked at her for a moment. "Time. The structure, the way you mapped the discrepancy pattern against the invoice cycles. That's not." She stopped. "This is prosecution-grade documentation." "Do you have a background in forensic accounting?" "No." Petra looked back at the screen and said nothing more, but her posture had changed. Something had recalibrated. Calloway was still in his office. This was the thing that kept pulling at Lena's attention as she worked. On's team had Pratt. They had the transit case. They had Lena's documentation and 8 months of federal surveillance. The perimeter of the operation was collapsing inward, and Calloway was sitting in his office with the door closed, and either he didn't know yet or he did know and had made a decision about what to do next. Either option was comfortable. She flagged Quinlan when the analyst stepped out for a moment. "Calloway hasn't moved." "I know that's not passive," Lena said. "Fine. When the external operation is being dismantled and the person at the center goes still, it's because they're doing something that doesn't require movement. Document destruction. A contingency." Ryan's expression tightened. "Our authorization to enter his office requires him to be served first. If we go in without, I'm not suggesting you go in without authorization. I'm telling you that 40 minutes of stillness in a crisis is a behavior pattern, and you should factor it into whatever your timeline is." Lena paused. "Does he know about Pratt yet?" "We don't think so." "Fine. Then find out fast, because the moment he does, the stillness ends, and whatever he's been doing for the past 40 minutes becomes a problem." "Fine." Quinlan looked at her for a second, really. Looked at her in the way people occasionally did when they were revising an assessment mid-conversation. Then she stepped away and got on her radio. Lena went back to the compilation. She was nearly finished, maybe 15 minutes of work left, when Tomas Reyes appeared in the records room doorway. He was still in his scrubs from the shift, which meant he hadn't left during the evacuation, and his expression carried the particular weight of someone who had been watching something terrible unfold and needed to say something about it. "They're saying you stole medication," he said. "I know what they're saying." "You." She looked up from the laptop. Tomas was a good nurse and a decent person, and they had worked side by side for 2 years without anything more than professional courtesy and the occasional shared frustration about understaffing. He deserved a straight answer. "No," she said. He exhaled. "Okay." He leaned against the doorframe. "Priya came to me after she filed the report. She said the way you handled it, asking for chain of custody. The footage, she said it didn't feel like someone who was guilty. I was right to file the report. She feels terrible about it." "She shouldn't. She did exactly what she should have done." Lena turned back to the screen. "Tell her that when you see her." Tomas stayed in the doorway for a moment. What's actually happening here, Lena?" She considered how to answer that. Whether Tomas had been in this building through the evacuation and the fire and the chaos of the morning, and he worked here, and whatever was about to happen was going to affect every person on staff. "The hospital has been used as part of a diversion operation," she said. "Controlled substances. Significant volume, extended period. Calloway is involved. The man who came in as the compliance consultant is involved." I stared at her. "The FBI has been investigating for months. This morning moved their timeline up." She paused. "It's going to be public by tonight. I wanted you to hear it from me before it gets chaotic." "Chaotic?" Tomas said carefully. "You mean more chaotic than it already is?" "Yes." He pushed off the doorframe. "Okay, I'm going back to the floor. I've got patience." He stopped Lena. "Yeah, fine, when this is over again." Reconsidering whatever he'd been about to say. Ended on something simpler. "Just, I'm glad you're still here." Left. She didn't nodded once, and he left. She finished the compilation at 12:41, transferred everything to the encrypted drive Petra had given her, got back, and looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds, which was all she was going to allow herself. Then Quinlan came through the door with an expression that had changed, and Lena knew before a word was said that something had happened. "Calloway's office," Quinlan said. The camera just went dark. Feed. The feed was cut from inside the administrative IT panel at his office. Quinlan's jaw was tight. We're moving up the service. They moved fast through the administrative hallway. Quinlan, 2 agents, and Lena, who had not been asked to come, but had not been told to stay either. The hallway was empty. The ambient sound of the hospital muted back here. The emergency response, having faded into the kind of quiet that followed contained crises. Calloway's office door was closed. Quinlan knocked. Procedure. Even now, Mr. Calloway, federal agents. Please open the door. Silence. She knocked again. Awesome. One of the agents had a building master override. And he used it. The door opened. The office was empty. Abandoned. Calloway's jacket was still draped over the chair, his coffee cup half full on the desk, his computer monitor still showing a screen that had locked automatically. The room looked like someone who had stepped out for 2 minutes. Except the secondary door, the one into the adjacent conference room, was standing open. The conference room was also empty. The conference room had a third door, which opened into the facilities management hallway, which connected to the south stairwell, which connected to my was already on her radio. Lena was already moving. Athens. She took the south stairwell at a pace that wasn't running, but was faster than anyone watching expected from someone who'd been through the morning she'd had. Down to the ground floor, through the corridor that connected to the hospital's south entrance. Not the main ER entrance, it's not the ambulance bay. But the staff and visitor entrance on the building's south face that most people forgot about because it faced the small surface lot rather than the main road. She came through the south entrance into bright midday light and scanned the surface lot. Calloway was there. He was 40 yards away, moving fast toward a gray sedan in the far row. Not running exactly, but the walk of a man who had passed the point of caring how it looked. He had a bag over one shoulder and his phone to his ear, and he had not yet looked back toward the entrance. Lena did not shout. She cut diagonally across the lot at an angle that used the parked cars for concealment and put her on an intercept course with the sedan before Calloway reached it. She had been moving at this pace for 30 meters before he saw her, and by then she was close enough that stopping to redirect would have cost him more time than he had. He pulled up short. He stared at her, Ms. Marsh. His voice was controlled thin at the edges. I don't know what you've been told, Richard. She'd never used his first name before, ended the way she intended it to. Don't get in the car. I have every right. To Gerald Pratt is in federal custody on the loading dock. The transit case he was moving has been seized. The documentation of your pharmacy access modifications and the Harrow invoice discrepancies is with the federal team right now. She watched his face. They have enough without you running. Just makes it worse. His jaw moved without sound for a moment. You did this, he said. The voice had changed. The control was gone, and what was underneath it was uglier than she'd expected. Not fear primarily, but a specific kind of rage at being outmaneuvered by someone he'd categorized, the same way Merritt had categorized her. The same base error showing up again. You were just a nurse. You were nobody, I know, she said. That was useful. Behind her, she could hear the south entrance opening, Han's voice, and the sound of agents spreading into the lot. Walkway looked past Lena toward them, then back at her. The calculation in his eyes ran its course and arrived at the only answer the math allowed. His hand came up. For 1 second she read it wrong, read it as compliance, a gesture of surrender, and then she read it correctly and moved because his hand wasn't empty, and what he was reaching for wasn't his phone. What happened in the next 4 seconds happened in a compressed sequence that Lena would later have difficulty narrating in chronological order because the body in those moments did not process time the way it processed everything else. She caught his wrist with both hands. The cuff remnant still on both wrists. Absurd detail directed the arm, used the redirected momentum to move his body into the car's doorframe, controlled his descent to the ground in a way that did not injure him severely, but also did not allow for any further options. Down. She had his wrist, the object he'd been reaching for, a small canister, some kind of personal deterrent, not a weapon in the lethal sense, but not nothing dropped and rolled under the car. Quinlan's agents reached them in seconds. Calloway was on the ground looking up at the midday sky with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the category he'd assigned a situation had been catastrophically wrong. Lena stepped back, let the agents do the rest. Lane was beside her. You all right? Yeah, you didn't have to. He was going to run. Quinlan looked at the agent securing Calloway. Back at Lena. Yeah, she said. Lena's hands were shaking. She registered this calmly as information the way she registered most physical data in high-stress situations. The debt from this morning was beginning to come due. Her shoulder ached, her wrists ached. The back of her mouth tasted like the specific metallic edge that came after adrenaline had been burning for several hours without proper fuel to back it up. life. She needed water and something to eat, and probably 8 hours of sleep, none of which were available. Away was being walked toward the federal vehicles. He had gone quiet, the ugliness had burned itself out, and what was left was a man doing the arithmetic on what the next phase of his life was going to look like. Ina watched him walk away and felt unexpectedly almost nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, nothing recognizable yet. Just the functional quiet of an operation that had reached a pause point and not yet resolved. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. It said, "You should know that Merritt made 3 calls before Quinlan told him to stop. We're tracking who he called. You may want to ask Quinlan whether any of those numbers connect to the state licensing board." She read the message twice, then she looked up. Merritt had made 3 calls. State licensing board, her nursing license. Whatever Calloway and Pratt had set in motion this morning, it wasn't finished with one arrest in a surface parking lot. There were still pieces moving. She turned and went to find Quinlan, and she was already 3 steps into the walk when her own phone rang. Not a text this time, a call from the number belonging to Dr. Okafor, the surgeon she'd helped in OR 3. She answered it. Miss Marsh, Okafor said. He sounded careful. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been asked to pass along something by someone who reached me through the hospital directory, and I wasn't sure if I should ignore it. Or is it? A man called. He said he was calling on behalf of the State Medical Licensing Board. He said there was a complaint filed against you this morning. Not the theft allegation, something else. Something about your nursing credentials." Lena stopped walking. He said Okafor continued that your nursing certification may have been falsified. That there are questions about your clinical training record. A pause. I told him I'd watched you work for 14 minutes in a dark OR with your hands in cuffs, and I didn't have much interest in what the paperwork said. But I thought you should know her training record. If someone had filed a complaint questioning her clinical credentials, even a false one, even one that would ultimately be disproven, the board would be required to initiate a review. During a review, her license could be suspended, not revoked, but suspended pending investigation. Which would mean that everything she'd done this morning, every action she'd taken in OR 3, every medical decision she'd made during the evacuation would be retroactively subject to scrutiny. And if the review uncovered her actual background, her actual training record, which was not a nursing school record, but something considerably more extensive and classified, it would open questions that she had spent 3 years keeping closed. Had thought this through. Not Calloway. Calloway was in handcuffs. Not Pratt was in handcuffs, someone else, one step back, who had been watching this morning's events, and as the primary pieces moved, had activated a contingency that Calloway's arrest hadn't touched. There was a third person in this building, Quinlan had said. The third is the person who's been running the operation that Pratt is connected to. Ina stood in the middle of the surface parking lot, with the phone to her ear, and looked back at the hospital buildings, its ordinary brick face and its signage and its windows, and understood that what had happened this morning was not the end of anything. It was the moment the real target had decided to stop being invisible. She ended the call with Okafor and stood still for 4 seconds, which was all she could afford. Licensing board. Complaint was filed this morning. That meant it had been prepared in advance. You didn't draft a formal complaint questioning clinical credentials in real time while your primary operation was falling apart. Someone had written it before the day started, held it in reserve, and deployed it when the first layer of the plan began to unravel. That level of contingency planning didn't belong to Calloway. Calloway was an administrator who had built a skimming operation inside an existing institution. Opportunistic, not architecturally careful. Whoever had written that complaint had been thinking 3 moves ahead. She found Quinlan near the federal convoy on the phone, one hand pressed against her opposite ear to block the ambient noise of the lot. Lena waited. When Quinlan ended the call, Lena told her about Okafor's message in 4 sentences. Quinlan's expression tightened in a specific way. Not surprise, but the particular compression of someone's receiving information that confirms a shape they'd already started to see. A third person, Lena said. Yeah. You knew there was a third person before today. We suspected we had transaction patterns that didn't originate with Calloway or Pratt. Upstream was receiving the diverted supply. We traced it to a distribution point, but not a person. The identity was layered behind 2 shell entities. Quinlan glanced toward the hospital. Licensing complaint complicates your position in the short term. If the board initiates a review, my background becomes part of the record, Lena said. And whoever filed the complaint knows that they're not trying to revoke my license. They're trying to force a disclosure. Quinlan was quiet for a moment. Why would they want your background disclosed? I don't know yet. But someone went to the trouble of anticipating that the primary operation would fail, and then built a contingency specifically targeting me. Not about the drugs. That's about what I am. She paused. What I was, your service record. There are things in that record that, if they become public in the context of a licensing investigation, will surface names and operations that certain people would prefer stayed buried. I don't know which specific thing they're after, but the filing is deliberate. She thought about it for another second. Who has access to federal contractor personnel files at the level of classification my record sits at? That's a jaw shifted. Yes, Lena said. It is. They went back inside. The hospital had settled into a post-emergency rhythm. That specific institutional exile that followed contained crises, where the adrenaline had burned down and the work of accounting for what had happened was beginning. Patients had been returned from the evacuation area. The North Wing power was stable. OR3's patient was in recovery. The ER was running at reduced capacity while administration sorted through the morning's disruption, and the nursing staff was doing what nursing staff always did in the wake of institutional chaos, which was continuing to function because there was no alternative. Had the floor organized by the time Lena walked through. She could see it in the bay arrangement beds repositioned for visibility, equipment staged in the recovery sequence, the kind of quiet, competent management that didn't call attention to itself. He caught her eye across the floor and looked away. Just doing the work. She respected that. Quinlan directed her team into the conference room, adjacent to the nursing station. Not Calloway's conference room, but the one on the ER side that was used for family briefings. Laptop up. Petra was on a call in the corner. More agent. A man named Stafford, who had not spoken to Lena directly at any point, but had been observing her since the convoy's arrival with the focused attention of someone building a file, positioned himself near the door. Tell me what you know about your service record, Quinlan said, once the door was closed. Offers. Specifically, is there anything in it that would be of active operational value to someone with access to diverted pharmaceuticals and a shell distribution network? Lena thought about how to answer that. She thought about it carefully, the way she had thought about a great many things over the past 3 years, when her past came close to the surface. There were operations I was attached to that involved interdiction of non-standard supply chains, in active theater environments. She kept her voice even. I worked with personnel who had embedded themselves in logistics networks. I know how those networks are structured, how they conceal movement, how they layer financial documentation. You were an asset in pharmaceutical interdiction operations, Quinlan said. Was a combat medic who was attached to operations that had interdiction components. The experience is incidental to my training, but yes. And if someone running a pharmaceutical diversion network knew that, they'd want to know what I knew, what specific operations I'd been attached to, I'd worked with. Lena looked at the table, and they'd want to know whether any of the networks I'd helped dismantle had connections to whatever they're running now. The Wren stopped typing. Petra ended her call. You think the diversion operation here is connected to something larger, Stafford said from the door. It was the first thing he'd said to her. I think the licensing complaint was filed by someone who wants my record opened in a formal proceeding. Licensing investigation generates documentation. Documentation is discoverable. If my service record becomes part of a state licensing board file, it's no longer a federal classification issue. It becomes a state administrative record with different access rules. She looked at Quinlan. Someone who knows enough to understand is not running a regional pharmaceutical skimming operation for the money. That's a specific kind of sophisticated. Quinlan's expression had settled into something that Lena recognized as controlled alarm. The professional face people wore when they were inwardly recalibrating the scale of what they were dealing with. I need to make a call, Quinlan said. She stood up and left the room. Lena sat with Wren and Petra and Stafford, and nobody said anything for 90 seconds, and then Petra's laptop chimed with something that made her sit forward sharply. Harrow transit case, Petra said. The one Pratt was moving this morning. Everyone looked at her. The lab preliminary is back. Octant is oxycodone. Consistent with the diversion pattern, she paused. The case also contained a secondary partition, pharmaceutical, digital storage. She turned the laptop screen so Lena could see it. Encrypted drives. 3M tech team is working the encryption now, but the drive architecture is military-grade encryption. On drives inside a pharmaceutical transit case, moving through a hospital loading dock. The shape of the thing shifted again. Lena felt it shift the way a pattern resolved from ambiguous to specific when the right piece came into view. What else? Was Harrow Supply contracted to move, she asked. Afta pulled up a document, scrolled pharmaceutical logistics as we established. But their contractor certification also covers, she stopped. Medical records. Digitization and archival under a federal hospital modernization grant. Medical records digitization. Mercy Hollow General had received a federal modernization grant 14 months ago. Lena knew about it because the grant had funded new documentation systems in the ER, and she had attended the mandatory training for the updated charting software. The grant had been administered through the hospital's administrative office. Through Callaway's office, and Harrow Supply had been the contracted vendor. They weren't just moving drugs, Lena said. They were moving data. Came back into the room 11 minutes later. Her face had changed, not dramatically. She was too controlled for dramatic. But the set of it was different, and when she looked at Lena, something in the look had shifted from operational to something more careful. I made 2 calls, she said. The first was to the Eastern District Task Force Coordinator. The second was to someone at the department level who has oversight of certain classified contractor records. She sat down. Your service record was accessed 14 days ago. I'm outside the system through a credentialed query that used a contractor authorization code that expired 6 months ago. The room was very quiet. Someone with an expired contractor authorization accessed my personnel file, Lena said slowly, and used the information in it to construct the licensing complaint. Which means they knew 14 days ago what they were going to need this morning. Quinlan folded her hands on the table. This wasn't a response to your record pulling. They were watching you before you started pulling records. That landed differently than anything else had. Lena had been operating on the assumption that the morning's events were reactive, that Callaway and his associates had noticed her activity and responded. The idea that she had been under surveillance before she even began. Her investigation changed the geometry of everything. They put me in place, she said. We don't know that yet. Someone accessed my file 14 days ago. I started noticing the pharmacy discrepancies 6 weeks ago, but I didn't begin accessing the record system until 3 weeks ago. Whoever accessed my file did it 1 week after I started digging. She thought about the sequence. They saw me start. They ran my record to understand who they were dealing with. And then they built the contingency around what they found. Which means Stafford said they weren't afraid of you. They were interested in you. The distinction was important. For produced suppression, the kind of crude setup Callaway had executed. It's produced something more deliberate, something that wanted to see how Lena moved before it showed itself. Spread her hands on the table. We need to talk about what happens next. Licensing complaint is a problem. Not because it will succeed, but because addressing it formally will take time we may not have if the third party is already moving. The encrypted drives are a problem because until I crack them, we don't know what data Pratt was removing or who it was going to. She looked at Lena. And you are a problem, I know, not in the way you think, I mean. You're a problem because you are the only person in this building who has seen the full picture, the pharmacy records, Callaway's behavior patterns, the physical layout, Pratt's access point. You know things that our 8-month surveillance didn't capture because you were inside it in a way we weren't. She paused. Which means whoever built the contingency around your service record also understands that removing you, discrediting you, tying up your license removes the only person who can connect the operational details in a way that a federal case needs. So the licensing complaint isn't about disclosure, Lena said. It's about both in that order. Lena looked at the table for a moment. Outside the conference room, she could hear the ER floor, the ordinary sounds of a hospital doing its work, monitors, voices, the soft percussion of equipment and movement. The sounds that had been the background of her life for 2 years and 4 months. Ordinary, deliberate, chosen. What do you need me to do? She said. We need you to help us build the thread that connects Harrow Supply's data operation to whoever was receiving it. The pharmaceutical skimming is cutable. We have that. If there's a larger network using Harrow's hospital access to move classified or sensitive data through a medical records digitization cover, that's a federal matter that goes significantly beyond this building. Quinlan held her gaze. It also means the people who filed the licensing complaint are not small players. They know where you work. The last sentence sat in the room without anyone adding to it. Lena understood what Quinlan was not quite saying. The licensing complaint had been filed this morning by someone who knew her name, her workplace, her service record classification, and exactly what moment to deploy the complaint for maximum disruption. person was not in custody. That person had watched Calloway and Pratt fail and had responded by activating a secondary measure. They were careful and they were fast and they were still out there. Where do we start? Lena asked. The grant, Petra said from behind her laptop. The federal modernization grant that brought Harrow Supply in. I'm pulling the application documentation now, she scrolled. The primary contact listed on our side of the grant application is not Pratt. It's a different name. She turned the screen. Lena read the name on the screen. She had seen it before, not recently. Further back than Mercy Hollow General. Further back than Dunmore. Further back than 3 years of deliberate civilian life. She had seen it in a different context, in a different part of her life, and the recognition hit with the particular quality of things you have tried to forget and discover you have not forgotten at all. She kept her face still. Do you recognize that name? Quinlan asked. Lena said from where she looked up from the screen. On before, she said. A long time before. She needed 20 minutes. She told Quinlan she needed 20 minutes, and Quinlan, to her credit, gave them to her without asking what she was going to do with them. Lena went to the ear break room. It was empty. She sat in the same chair. She had sat in that morning, already a different era 4 hours ago, when the problem had still looked like a medication discrepancy and a corrupt administrator. Athens. She pressed her hands flat on the table and made them stop, shaking through force of concentration the way she had learned to do in conditions where shaking hands was not an option. The name on the screen was Declan Vore. She had last seen Declan Vore's name on a mission brief dated 4 years ago. I had attached to a contractor profile that had been flagged for irregular supply management in a forward operating area in a country she would not have named out loud in a civilian setting. The flag had gone nowhere. Not because the concern wasn't valid, but because Vore had connections at the contracting oversight level that made the flag disappear. She had noted this at the time, filed it in the category of things she couldn't control, and continued her assignment. Then she had left the military, and Declan Vore had apparently not stopped. What Harrow Supply was doing at Mercy Hollow General was a version of what certain contractors had been doing in deployed environments for years, using access to medical logistics infrastructure to move things that weren't on the manifest. The difference was geography. The domestic version was more careful, more layered, more dependent on institutional cover. A hospital modernization grant was elegant cover. Nobody audited pharmaceutical logistics companies attached to federally funded hospital improvement initiatives with any particular rigor. Offer had found a template that worked in one environment and transplanted it to another. And for 11 months it had worked until a nurse with an inconvenient background had started paying attention to the medication counts. She sat with this for the remaining 11 of her 20 minutes. Then she went back to the conference room. The name on the grant application, she said to Quinlan. Declan Vore. He had a contractor profile in the military logistics system 4 years ago. It was flagged for irregular supply management, and the flag was suppressed. He has contacts at the federal contracting oversight level, people who can manage paper trails. She sat down. If his name is on Harrow's grant application, it's because he's not afraid of it being there. Because he has a version of that name on file that looks clean. Which means he has people in the system, Quinlan said. At minimum. What was his operational area 4 years ago? Medical logistics coordination in active theater. He had access to pharmaceutical inventory systems, medical records infrastructure, and contractor communication networks. She paused. The same categories Harrow Supply is contracted for at this hospital. Quinlan looked at Stafford. Something passed between encrypted drives, Stafford said. If Vore has been running a domestic version of a military logistics skimming operation, may contain records he was moving before the federal team got close. Lena finished. Pharmaceutical records, operational records, contracts, contacts, financial structures. He needs to reconstruct the operation somewhere else if this location gets burned. Perhaps. He was pulling out, Wren said from behind his laptop. That's what Pratt was doing on the loading dock. Not just moving drugs. Moving the archive, the record of an operation that had been running for 11 months in this hospital, and, if Lena was reading the shape of it correctly, in other locations before this one. A nomadic operation that used hospital modernization grants as entry points, built distribution infrastructure under pharmaceutical logistics cover, and when the location became untenable, pulled the records and moved. The pharmaceutical diversion was funding, the data was the product. She didn't know what the data was, not yet, but she knew that Vore was not in this room, not in this building, and not in custody, and the encrypted drives were in federal hands but not yet open. And until they were open, nobody knew how much time they had before whatever Vori was protecting found another way out. How long on the encryption, she asked Wren. Our tech team has been on it for 5 minutes. Military-grade layered encryption, they said best estimate another 2 to 3 hours. 2 to 3 hours, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from the same unknown number that had warned her about Merritt's calls. Words. He's in the building. She read it twice. Up. The conference room was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. Quinlan, Wren, Petra, Stafford, the hum of equipment, and the muffled sound of the hospital beyond the door. Back. Who? The reply came in 8 seconds. Offer. Came in through the south entrance 20 minutes before you caught Calloway. He's been in the building this whole time. He knows the drives are seized. Not here for the drives. Her stomach went cold. Up. Quinlan? Quinlan read her face and was already standing. Declan is in this building. He came in through the south entrance. He's been here since before we caught Calloway. She held up the phone. He's not here to recover the operation. He's here for something else. How do you know this? Someone's been feeding me information since this morning. I don't know who. But they've been accurate. Every time she looked at the door. If Vori is here, and he knows the drives are seized, and he's not here for the drives. Stafford. Got it first, the witness. Everyone in the room understood it simultaneously. The pharmaceutical case was prosecutable. Without Lena, Quinlan had said that. But the larger operation, the data movement, the contractor network, the connections to the federal oversight level, where Vor's people had suppressed the flag 4 years ago. That case was not prosecutable without someone who could place Vori in the context of the original irregular activity. Someone who had been there, someone whose classified service record contained the dates, the location, and the operational details that it would connect what Harrow Supply had done in this hospital to what Declan Vore had been doing for years. There was only one person in Mercy Hollow General who fit that description. Ina turned toward the door. Stay here, Quinlan said, reaching for her radio. He knows this building, Lena said. He's been in it. He's been here through Harrow's contract. He knows the layout. He knows the access points. She thought about the south entrance, the facilities management corridor, the secondary conference room, the routes she had used herself this morning. I know those routes too, and I know what he looks like. Quinlan's radio was already up. She was calling positions. Icons. Outside the conference room window, the ER floor moved with its ordinary rhythm nurses, patients, equipment, the functional machinery of a hospital that had survived a difficult morning and was pushing toward afternoon. Somewhere in this building, a man who had been operating in the shadows of medical infrastructure for years had made the calculation that the only real threat to his continued operation was a quiet nurse who knew too much about too many things. And he had walked in through the south entrance to do something about it. Ina was already moving toward the door when the lights in the ER corridor went out. Not the whole building, not the main power this time. Just the corridor section outside the conference room and the nursing station and the bay area beyond it, plunging the floor into the flat red of emergency lighting. And somewhere on the ER floor a monitor began alarming, and then a second monitor joined it, and through the conference room window, Lena could see the nursing staff beginning to react, beginning to move, and somewhere in the controlled confusion of that reaction was the space that a careful man would use. She went through the door. The emergency lighting turned the ER floor into something that felt smaller than it was, the red-edged shadows collapsing depth, making distances unreliable. Ina moved through it without hesitating, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear in low-visibility environments was a resource problem, and she didn't have resources to spare. The nursing staff was reacting the way undertrained staff reacted to unexpected power loss, clustering near the manual override panel at the station, reaching for flashlights, calling across bays to each other. The sounds were controlled but fraying at the edges. 3 monitors were alarming, and the Bay 5 patient, whoever they were, needed someone to physically verify their status, because the monitor's alarm could mean a dozen things, and without power-stable readouts, none of them were distinguishable by sound alone. She went to Bay 5 first. The patient was a woman in her 70s, post-procedure, pulse palpable at the wrist, airway clear, the monitor alarming, because the power interruption had caused the sensor lead to partially detach. Ina reseated it. The alarm stopped. The woman who had been awake and holding the bed rail looked at her. Is the building on fire again? She asked. No, Lena said. I've just a circuit issue. You're fine. You don't look like you're here about the circuit. I'm not, Lena said and moved. She had a 40-second window, maybe less, before Quinlan's team spread through the floor in a way that would also spread confusion and push whoever was moving through the building into a decision point. She needed to understand the geometry before that happened. Structure had come in through the south entrance, which put him in the facilities management corridor. From there, the fastest route to the ER floor, without passing visible camera positions, was through the linen corridor on the building's interior west wall. She had used that corridor twice. It was narrow, poorly lit under normal conditions, and connected to the ER supply alcove through a door that most staff left propped because the latch was unreliable. She moved toward the supply alcove. The door was propped. She stopped outside it and listened. The ambient hospital noise was enough to mask ordinary movement, but there were things you couldn't mask: entirely weight distribution on a particular section of flooring. Specific air pressure change when a body occupied a space that a moment before had been empty. The alcove was occupied. She didn't go in. She moved to the left of the door frame and put her back to the wall and pulled out her phone and sent a single message to Quinlan's number: Supply alcove west wall. Not send more than 2. Then she waited. What she was doing was tactically imperfect, and she knew it. She was an unarmed civilian nurse with bruised wrists and a half-day's worth of accumulated physical debt. Positioning herself outside a room she had reasonable cause to believe contained a man who had spent years operating in environments where removing inconvenient people was a problem with practical solutions. The behavior was to wait for Quinlan's team. She waited for 45 seconds. Then she heard something from inside the alcove that made waiting impossible. It was Tomas, his voice, low and alarmed, saying, "I don't understand what you want," and then stopping mid-sentence in a way that suggested something had stopped it. The alcove was a long, narrow room, shelved floor to ceiling on both sides, with a central aisle wide enough for a single supply cart. Emergency lighting from a battery unit near the ceiling cast everything in flat white rather than red, which was better. At the far end of the aisle, Tomas was backed against the shelving, with his hands up in the instinctive way of someone who had been told without words that raising them was the correct choice. The man in front of him was not large, medium height, lean, with the kind of stillness that people who had operated in dangerous environments sometimes developed, where the lack of unnecessary movement became itself a form of presence. Declan Vore was in his late 40s. He had a face that was unremarkable in a deliberate way, the kind of face that didn't linger in memory. He was wearing hospital-standard visitor credentials clipped to his jacket, which told her that he had planned his entry down to the badge. He turned when she came through the door. He wasn't surprised. He had positioned himself with sightlines to both the door and Tomas, which meant he had anticipated the door opening. He hadn't anticipated, she could tell from the fractional pause, was who came through it. "Lena Marsh," he said. "Let him go," she said. "He doesn't know anything." No, Vore said. "He's a convenience, not a target." I needed the floor cleared for 60 seconds. He studied her with a directness that was almost clinical. "You look worse than I expected, given the morning." "You look exactly like I expected," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, but recalibration. "You know who I am, Declan Vore, Harrow Supply, medical logistics contractor, active theater 4 years ago. You had an irregular supply management flag that got suppressed." She kept her voice even. "I filed a portion of that flag." The pause was longer this time. "You were the medic on the Kellner detail," he said. Yes, he absorbed this. She watched him do it, watched the operational calculation running behind his eyes, the reordering of what he thought he knew about what had happened this morning and why. He had read her service record. He had known she was former military. He had not known, apparently, that she was specifically the person who had flagged him 4 years ago. That's an interesting coincidence," he said. "I don't think it's a coincidence," she said. "I think Calloway hired me because I was a qualified nurse with a clean-looking civilian record. I don't think either of you knew who I was until I started pulling records beside. And then you looked me up and found out, and then I found out," he agreed. Which is when this became complicated. "You can let him go now," Lena said, looking at Tomas. "Seriously. He's going to stand there with his hands up and be very unhelpful to both of us. Let him go." Vore glanced at Tomas, made the same assessment. "Oh," he said. Tomas looked at Lena. She nodded. He moved toward the door fast and was gone. Wow. It was just the two of them in the narrow alcove, and Lena was aware of the shelving on both sides and the distance between herself and the door, and the fact that Quinlan's team had not yet arrived, which meant she had bought herself a conversation she needed to make count. "Licensing complaint," she said. "You filed it to force my service record into a state administrative proceeding. Open the record, access the Kellner detail documentation. Identify who else was on that operation." "You're good at this," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. Sophomore. The acknowledgement of a competency he hadn't expected to be inconvenienced by. It's on the drives. His expression didn't change. Lines. The encrypted drives your man Pratt was moving this morning, she said. They're in federal custody. Our tech team is working the encryption. You already know they're going to get in. You built in a time window, which is why you came here instead of running. Whatever's on those drives, you need it not to matter before they open them. And how would I accomplish that from inside a hospital with federal agents in the parking lot? By removing the only person who can provide the contextual testimony that makes the drive contents prosecutable. She held his gaze. The pharmaceutical diversion is a separate case. Clean documentation, clear chain of custody, prosecutable without me. But if those drives contain what I think they contain, rankers of the data movement operation, the federal contractor network, the oversight contacts who suppressed the flag 4 years ago, that case requires a witness who was present for the original activity. And someone who can establish continuity, someone like you, like me. He was quiet for a moment. The emergency lighting hummed above them. Not afraid, he said. It was an observation, not a question. I'm afraid, she said. I'm just not letting it make decisions for me. Something passed across his face that was almost, not exactly, but a recognition of someone who had spent a long time in environments where the line between competence and survival was very thin, encountering someone who understood the same line. It didn't make him less dangerous. She didn't mistake it for that. Walk out with me, he said. You've done what you've done this morning. The pharmaceutical case is intact. Calloway and Pratt are in custody. That's a substantial outcome. He tilted his head slightly. Rest of it. The drives, the network, whatever you think you know about 4 years ago. That's a much larger thing than this building. Much larger than you. I know, she said. Then you understand why it would be better for you, specifically, concretely better for your continued well-being, to let it be. I understand what you're saying, she said. I don't agree with the conclusion. He moved not toward her, toward the shelving to his right, which was a tell, because moving toward the shelving meant he was repositioning rather than leaving, and repositioning in a narrow space meant he was thinking about angles. She shifted her weight without making it visible. The supply alcove door opened behind her. Quinlan came through first, which was wrong. Lena would have sent a subordinate first. But Quinlan was that kind of agent which she was beginning to understand. 2 agents came in behind her. One of them was Stafford, who had his credentials out and was already stating the federal identification protocol in a voice designed to leave no ambiguity about what was happening. I went still. He looked at Quinlan, at Stafford, the second agent. He did the arithmetic, Declan Vor, Quinlan said. You're being detained for questioning in connection with a federal investigation. Move. He didn't move. He stood in the alcove with the same controlled stillness, and he looked at Lena once more, and the look was not anger. It was something colder and more considered, the look of a man filing information away for later use. She met it without looking away. Then Stafford was moving him toward the door, and Quinlan was beside Lena, and the alcove, which had been very small for the past several minutes, felt suddenly much larger. You had 60 seconds, said quietly. Tomas was in there. Fine. We saw him come out. She looked at Lena. Eyes. You could have waited. He was repositioning another 30 seconds, and the geometry changes. She paused. I've dealt with his type before. Waiting makes them more options, not fewer. Fine. Gwyn looked like she wanted to argue this, and had decided it wasn't worth the time. Come on. We need to debrief before the U.S. Attorney's Office gets here. The U.S. Attorney's Office arrived at 2:14 in the form of a woman named Claire Ashford, who was approximately 50, moved quickly for someone carrying a briefcase that heavy, and had the manner of a person who had been doing difficult things for a long time, and was no longer surprised by any of them. She set up in the same conference room Quinlan's team had been using, reviewed the core documentation in under 40 minutes, and then asked to speak with Lena. They sat across from each other at the conference table. Ashford had a legal pad but hadn't written anything on it yet. Tell me about the Kellner detail, Ashford said. Lena told her. Everything. There were components that remained classified, and she identified them as such. And Ashford noted that without pressing, the relevant operational context, the supply irregularities she had flagged, the contractor profile that connected to Vor, and the manner in which the flag had been suppressed. She told it in order without editorializing, in the same flat factual register she had used in after-action reports. Ashford listened without interrupting. When Lena finished, Ashford wrote something on the legal pad. Context. Who suppressed the flag? Do you have a name? I have a partial identification. I reported to my chain of command. flag was returned to me as non-actionable, with a notation that indicated the review had been conducted at the federal contracting oversight level. I don't know the specific individual, but the notation included a division code I can provide. Please do. Lena gave it to her. Ashford wrote it down and underlined it twice. Licensing complaint, Ashford said. The board received it this morning. I spoke with the board chair an hour ago. Given the circumstances, an active federal investigation, evidence that the complaint was filed using information obtained through an unauthorized access of your personnel record, the board has agreed to suspend the review pending our investigation. License is not suspended. She said it without particular inflection, as if it were a procedural detail. Unsuppose. Thank you, Lon said. Athens. Don't thank me yet. There's going to be a formal proceeding around the personnel record access. Your service history is going to become part of the federal record in this case. That can't be avoided. It's the evidentiary foundation for the Vor connection. Ashford looked at her directly. You spent 3 years keeping that record buried. Yes. That ends. Lena absorbed this. She had known it was coming, had known it since the moment she opened the folder Quinlan had handed her in the ER corridor, if not before. A quiet civilian life she had built at Mercy Hollow General, the careful ordinariness she had maintained, the 2 years and 4 months of keeping her head down and treating everyone with patience, all of that had been operating on borrowed time. From the moment she started pulling pharmacy records, she had made a choice when she started pulling those records. She understood that now more clearly than she had at the time. All right, she said. The encrypted drives, Ashford continued, are going to take time to open. And they do. We anticipate finding contractor network records, financial structures, and potentially the identification of the oversight contact who suppressed your flag. So that opens a case significantly larger than what's in this building. You'll be a material witness in that case, I understand. It will be public. Understand, she said again. Ashford looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite sympathy, too professional for that, but contained a kind of acknowledgement. You know, most people who have what you have in their record would have let the pharmacy discrepancy go. No, Lena said. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the medication count that had first caught her attention, the careful incremental record pulling, the notepad in the glove compartment. The 2 years of watching patients move through a system that she had chosen to work in because she had spent enough time in environments where the systems existed to serve people who weren't the patients. Because the people it was hurting didn't have anyone else looking, she said. Ashford wrote something on the legal pad, then she closed it. Afternoon moved in the way. Afternoons moved after high-pressure mornings, slowly, bureaucratically, with long stretches of waiting, broken by bursts of procedural activity that required Lena's presence and attention. She gave 2 more formal statements, one to Quinlan's team, one to an investigator from the state police who had been brought in to address the local criminal charges against Calloway and Pratt. She walked Petra through the pharmacy record compilation 3 times until the analyst was confident she could reconstruct Lena's methodology independently. She answered questions about the building layout, about the grant timeline, about what she had and hadn't heard in Calloway's hallway on that morning 6 weeks ago when she'd first started paying attention. At 4:30, she went to the break room and ate a granola bar she found in her own locker and drank the hospital's bad coffee and sat quietly for 8 minutes. At 4:42, Wren appeared in the doorway, he said. Locked up. First layer is open. It's going to take longer on the full decryption, but the file directory is visible. He paused. You were right about the data movement. There are records in there from 4 other hospital systems. Different states, different grant programs, same contractor structure, or predecessors, using the same methodology. He looked at his own hands for a second as if he wasn't sure how to say the next part. Also, a personnel directory. Federal contractor employees, oversight contacts, individuals in regulatory positions. Lots of them are active. The oversight network, Lena said. Bigger than we thought. He met her eyes, significantly bigger. She set down the coffee. Vor knew the drives would eventually open, she said. He came here anyway. He came here because the drives opening without the witness testimony means the records are harder to contextualize. With your testimony, the whole thing connects. Without it, he shook his head. Complicated. He wasn't going to kill me, she said, more to herself than to Wren working through it. He was going to offer me something. Cove. He was setting up a negotiation. Walk away, let the network stay intact, and whatever he had on leverage either gets used or doesn't. She looked at the table. Licensing complaint wasn't just to discredit me. It was a pressure tool, something to hold over me. Does that change anything? She thought about it honestly. 5. No, she said. It just explains the shape of the morning better. I nodded slowly. Quinlan wants you when you're ready. Ashford is still here. There are about 4 more hours of procedure ahead of you. He paused. It's worth. And I realize I don't know you and this may land wrong. I've been doing this for 6 years. 5. I've never seen anyone hold a situation together the way you did today. Fit from the evacuation all the way through the alcove. Lena looked at him. He meant it, she could tell by the slightly uncomfortable way he'd said it, like someone delivering honesty they weren't sure was wanted. I've had practice. She left. She finished the bad coffee. At 6:15, the news broke publicly. She was in the hallway outside Quinlan's temporary operations room when her phone lit up with the first push notification from the local news feed. A brief, cautious headline about a federal law enforcement action at Mercy Hollow General Hospital. An administrator taken into custody, an ongoing investigation. Within 20 minutes, 3 more outlets had versions of the story, each with slightly more detail, each still short on specifics because the federal team was managing what was releasable. Texted her at 6:30, the message said, "The whole floor is talking." Okay. She typed back working talk later. He sent a thumbs up and nothing else. 7 o'clock, Calloway had been formally charged controlled substance diversion, fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. That had been formally charged on similar counts, plus evidence tampering. Vore was being held for questioning under the Federal Detention Authority, which meant the charges were being built carefully, because Vore's people would have very good legal representation and the case needed to be airtight. The pharmaceutical diversion case was clean, as Quinlan had said it would be. Ina's documentation, combined with the federal surveillance and the Harrow financial records, created a chain of evidence with no significant gaps. Larger case. The contractor network, the oversight contacts, the 4 other hospital systems in the drive directory, was the beginning of something that would take months and possibly years and would involve federal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. Ina's role in that case would be as a material witness, and the timeline on her testimony was long. She understood all of this. She sat with it, in the way she sat with things that were large and heavy and not immediately resolvable, present with it, not fighting it. At 7:20, Officer Connie Fass knocked on the doorframe of the room where Lena was sitting. Athens. She looked up. Foz was still in uniform, which meant she hadn't left the building in 9 hours. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been processing a lot of information that required revising conclusions they'd been confident in. I wanted to tell you, Foss said, that the arrest this morning, the way it was handled. She stopped, uttered again. I want to be clear that I documented everything. The physical contact, the manner of the transport. I filed the full report this afternoon. She paused. Officer Merritt is under internal review. Lena looked at her steadily. Did you document it at the time? Yes, in my notebook. Everything. Then you did the right thing. She held the woman's gaze. It's not a small thing to document your own partner. Foss's jaw shifted. It's not a small thing that he did. No, Lena agreed. It isn't. Foss left. Lena sat with the quiet for another moment. Then Quinlan appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been waiting for one more thing to arrive before moving forward, and it had arrived. Directory, she said. Our tech team found a subfolder. She crossed to the table and set her phone down, screen facing Lena. Specifically nested inside the oversight contact records. Lena looked at the screen. The subfolder was labeled with a string of numbers that was not a date and not a reference code, but looked to someone who had worked in a specific kind of operational context. Like something else entirely. And a class identification string from a classified communication system that had been decommissioned 2 years ago. Beneath the folder label was a single document preview. List of names. She scanned the list. Halfway down, she saw a name she recognized. Not Vore's name. Not anyone connected to Harrow Supply. A name that belonged to someone currently serving in a federal oversight position. Whose role gave them authority over exactly the kind of contractor review process that had suppressed her flag 4 years ago. She looked up at Quinlan. That person, Quinlan said carefully, is scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee in 9 days on federal contractor oversight reform. The room was very quiet. They're going to testify about reforming the system you've been corrupting, Lena said. That appears to be the case. And Vore has their name in an encrypted drive that he was trying to move out of this building this morning. Yes. She looked back at the screen at the name. At the congressional subcommittee date that Quinlan had noted in the margin of the document preview in her own handwriting. Wasn't just protecting the network, Lena said slowly. He was protecting a timeline. Something is supposed to happen before that testimony. Lines. Something that the network needs in place before the subcommittee convenes. She looked at Quinlan. Lives have 4 other hospital systems in them. 4 other locations where the same operation ran. If those operations are still active, we're already pulling the other hospital records, Quinlan said. 3 of the 4 systems are in states with active federal grant programs currently running. She paused. The 4th one closed 18 months ago. Why did it close? Quinlan's expression shifted. The staff member who first flagged the discrepancy was let go. Egg was suppressed. The operation moved on the same template. A different hospital, a different person who had noticed what was wrong and paid for it. Lena looked at the list of names on the screen one more time. What do you need from me? She said. Quinlan picked up her phone. We need to move fast. The U.S. attorney is in contact with the subcommittee chair right now. But we have 9s and 3 active operations and a federal witness list that just got considerably more complicated. She looked at Lena squarely. And we need you rested, documented, and ready, because your testimony is the thread that ties Vor to the 4-year history. Without it, the drive contents are records without context. I understand. You should go home, sleep whatever your system needs to recover from today. Quinlan picked up her briefcase. 8. Formal deposition begins at 9. She walked toward the door, stopped Lena. It was the first time Quinlan had used her first name. The person who's been sending you the text messages. Unknown number. Lena waited. We've identified them. Quinlan's expression was careful, precise. It's someone you worked with on the Kellner detail. A pause. I'm someone who's been watching Vori's operation from inside it for the past 14 months. A Kellner detail. Someone who had been there, who had seen what she had seen, and had made a different choice about how to handle it. Not flagging it outright, but getting closer to it, embedding deeper, waiting for the right moment. 18 months inside Harrow Supply's operation. They're the reason the licensing complaint went to Okafor, instead of directly to the board's suspension authority, Quinlan said. Put it down. Bought you the window. She looked at Lena steadily. They're also the reason we had a position close enough to the south entrance to confirm Vori's entry. Lena absorbed this slowly. Someone she had served with who had spent over a year inside the operation, she had been unwittingly adjacent to managing pieces of the morning's events from inside the machinery itself. Are they safe? She asked. Currently, Quinlanson said. Complicated. She left Lena sat alone in the room and looked at the wall and let everything from the past 11 hours settle through her in whatever order it needed to settle. The granola bar had not been sufficient. Her shoulder was going to be stiff tomorrow. The cuff marks on her wrists had darkened to something that would take a week to fade. She pulled out her phone and looked at the unknown number's message history. 4 messages over the course of the day, each one accurate. Precisely timed, each one written in a way that was brief and specific and gave her exactly what she needed without anything extra. I know who you are now, or approximately who. Thank you. She waited. The reply came after 90 seconds. Thank me, yet. There's one more thing you don't know. Ask. Quinlan, what was in the secondary partition of the 3rd drive? They haven't mentioned. She stared at the message. Ask her tonight. Before the deposition tomorrow, because what's in that partition changes who you can trust in that room. She found Quinlan in the parking lot, standing beside the lead SUV with her phone to her ear and her back to the building. Lena waited 4 steps away until the call ended. The evening had come in without her noticing the sky over the hospital, a deep bruised blue, the surface lot lit by overhead floods that made everything look flat and institutional. Somewhere on the other side of the building, the news vans had set up. She could see the light bleed above the roofline. Quinlan lowered the phone and turned. 3rd drive. Lena said the secondary partition. I haven't mentioned it. The pause was brief, barely a half second. But it was there, and it told her that the pause was not about not knowing what Lena was referring to. Who told you about that? Quinlan asked. The same source who told me Vor was in the building. The same source who slowed down the licensing complaint. Lena held Quinlan's gaze. Someone who spent 14 months inside Harrow's operation, and apparently knows the contents of all 3 drives, was well enough to know which partition your team hasn't brought up. She paused. So tell me what's in it. Quinlan looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the building, and then at the lot, and then she made a decision that Lena could see forming in real time. There are communications in that partition, Quinlan said carefully. Between Vor and individuals in the federal contracting oversight structure. We established that, but there is a second thread in those communications. A separate exchange with someone outside that network. She stopped. Who's someone in federal law enforcement? Quinlan said it without inflection, the way people stated things that were going to have very large consequences. A communications detail. A request from Vor to that individual placed approximately 4 months ago. The request was for information about an active federal investigation into a pharmaceutical diversion operation. It was quiet except for distant traffic and the hum of the SUV's electronics. Inside a federal investigation told Vor what you were building, Lena said. The communications are preliminary. We haven't established whether the information was actually provided or whether the exchange was more exploratory. It's going to require careful analysis before we know what we're looking at. Quinlan's voice was controlled, but her jaw was tight. It's also going to require us to be very deliberate about who is in the deposition room tomorrow. Is it someone on your team? No, the investigation that was compromised, if it was compromised, was a different field office's operation. Pre-existing surveillance that we were aware of but not running. She looked at Lena directly. But it means there's a possibility that Vor had warning about the federal timeline. Which raises the question of whether certain events this morning were more anticipated than we thought. Lena stood with this. The morning assembled itself differently with this piece in place. Not completely differently, but with certain moments sharper. Walkaway's calm. When he'd suspended her Pratt's readiness in the loading dock. The way the licensing complaint had been so precisely calibrated for the moment, the primary operation came under pressure. He knew you were close, she said, not the specific date, but the window. He started moving the archive because he knew the timeline was tightening. That's our assessment. Yes, and the drive communications, if they become part of the formal record. Quinlan said, that's not negotiable. However, uncomfortable it is for whatever agency is implicated. Those communications are evidence in a federal prosecution. She paused. Which is also why your source told you to ask tonight. Because whatever is in that partition becomes part of tomorrow's deposition record, and you needed to know the landscape before you walked into that room. Lena looked at the sky for a moment. The thing she had learned over years of operating in environments where the institutions were supposed to be trustworthy and sometimes weren't, was that the failure of an institution was not the same as the failure of every person in it. Ian had told her Fass had documented the arrest. Had filed the report Okafor had called her. Someone inside Harrow Supplies operation. Someone whose name she still didn't know had spent 14 months keeping things from getting worse. The institutions were imperfect. The people inside them were imperfect. That was not a reason to stop. All right, she said. I'll be here at 8. She drove home. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital, which had always been a deliberate choice. Close enough to get back fast if she was called in, far enough to feel like a different place. It was a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that was not charming but was clean and quiet, and she had lived in it for 2 years and made it neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just functional. The kind of home someone built when they weren't sure how long they were staying. She stood in the kitchen for a while without doing anything purposeful. Made actual food, eggs, toast, the end of a bag of spinach she hadn't gotten around to finishing, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt like it would require something she didn't have left tonight. Her shoulder had stiffened considerably in the past 2 hours. The bruising on her wrists was visible enough that she'd had to answer a question about it from the state investigator, which she had done factually and without editorializing. She thought about the person who had been sending the messages, someone she had served with, who had watched the same thing she had watched 4 years ago and made a different calculation, not walking away but moving closer. 14 months inside a corrupt operation, managing it from the inside, feeding information out through a channel she didn't understand yet. It was not the choice she would have made. It was also not nothing. She washed the plate in the pan and went to bed at 9:47, which was earlier than she had gone to bed in months. The deposition began at 9. Ashford ran it with the efficiency of someone who had prepared extensively and did not intend to use more time than the preparation required. Stafford. Room contained Ashford, Quinlan Stafford, 2 additional attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a federal court reporter in Lena. The drive communications, including the secondary partition contents, were formally entered into the evidentiary record at 9:42. Ashford named the individual implicated in the exchange with Vor without any ceremony a field supervisor in a separate FBI field office who had been placed on administrative leave that morning, pending internal affairs review. Quinlan's expression during this portion of the deposition was the expression of someone's distance with something genuinely bad. Performing equanimity, but working at it, Lena respected that. Gave her testimony over 6 hours with 2 breaks. 5. She was precise. She was thorough. She corrected herself twice once when she initially misstated the timing of an event and caught it before Ashford once, when her recollection of a specific detail from the Kellner operation was partial, and she identified it as partial rather than presenting it as complete. 5. The corrections were noted by the court reporter, where she understood the kind of honesty that made testimony credible rather than undermining it. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Ashford set down her pen. "Is there anything you want to add that hasn't been covered?" she asked. Ina thought about it. The 4 other hospital systems in the drive directory. Member at the 4th location, the one whose flag was suppressed 18 months ago and who was let go. I'd like to know if they're findable, if they're willing to provide a supporting statement. Ashford looked at her over the top of her glasses. "We're working on that. I know I'm asking to be kept informed. That's a reasonable request." She wrote something down. "I'll see what I can do." The deposition ended at 3:40. 3 weeks moved like 3 weeks do when you're waiting for large institutional processes to complete in irregular patches busy. Then quiet, then busy again with long stretches where nothing visible was happening, but everything important was. Ina went back to the ER floor 4 days after the deposition. The hospital was under a court-appointed administrative oversight board. Calloway's replacement was an interim director brought in from the state health department. A competent and somewhat overwhelmed woman named Elise Drummond, who had the unenviable task of running a hospital while everything administrative above her was either under investigation or being rebuilt. Drummond had introduced herself to Lena on the first day back with the directness of someone who had read all the relevant files and decided that directness was the right approach. I know what happened," Drummond said. "I know your role in it. I want you to know that your position here is not in question." "I appreciate that," Lena said. "I also want you to know that I've been told the nursing license issue is formally closed. The board's review was suspended, and the complaint was withdrawn from the record." Ine told me. "Good." Drummond paused. "Is there anything you need to continue doing your job?" Ina considered the IV pump that was still broken now 3 weeks on. "There's a pump in Bay 4 that maintenance has been promising to fix since before all of this started." Drummond wrote it down. The pump was repaired the following morning. The public charges against Calloway and Pratt were filed in federal court in the 4th week. The coverage was significant, not national level, but substantial in the region, and the details that became public were specific enough that the people who worked at Mercy Hollow General could read between the lines of the official language and understand what had been happening in that building for nearly a year. A diversion operation. The grant scheme, the way Harrow Supply had used the hospital's own systems against itself. Ina read the coverage once and did not read it again. I was charged in the 5th week. The charges were federal, multi-jurisdictional, and detailed pharmaceutical diversion, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, and 3 counts connected to the data movement operation across the 4 hospital systems. Oversight contact whose name had appeared in the drive directory was named as a co-conspirator. The field supervisor implicated in the drive's secondary partition communications was separately charged with providing information to a target of a federal investigation. The congressional subcommittee testimony, one scheduled 9 days after Vor's arrest, was postponed pending the investigation's expansion. When it eventually happened 6 weeks later than planned, the agenda had changed considerably. It was no longer testimony about reforming contractor oversight. It was testimony before a different and considerably less friendly committee about how the oversight system had been used by the people responsible for overseeing it. Ina was not in that hearing room. She watched 20 minutes of it on her phone during a break between patients, then put her phone away and went back to work. Officer Dale Merritt's internal review concluded in the 6th week. The findings were made public through the department's required transparency reporting, use of excessive force during a detention that had been initiated under false pretenses, conduct unbecoming, and a secondary finding related to the calls he had made on the morning of the incident calls, that while not rising to criminal conspiracy, demonstrated a pattern of contact with individuals connected to the hospital's administrative structure that was inconsistent with his professional obligations. He was terminated. The termination was appealed. The appeal was denied. Ina found out through Tomas, who had seen the department's public report. He mentioned it briefly at the nursing station during a slow patch on a Thursday afternoon. "Cop." Tomas said. "Merritt, he's out, I heard," she said. "Okay." She thought about the supply alcove, about the wall in the consultation room, about the parking lot where she'd stood in handcuffs in the morning light and let her hands shake, for exactly the amount of time she could afford, and then stopped. Ah, she said. Tomas nodded. He handed her a chart. They went back to work. Source. The person who had spent 14 months inside Harrow Supply's operation had a name which Lena learned in the 7th week when Quinlan called to tell her that the individual had been formally debriefed, cleared of any liability for their participation in the operation given the documented intent and the information they had provided, and was cooperating fully with the expanded federal case. This name was Marcus Riley. She had known Marcus Riley as a corpsman. Not the same specialty, not the same unit exactly, but the same deployment rotation on the Kellner detail. He had been methodical in the way of people who took careful notes on things they expected to matter later. She had respected him without knowing him well, which was the category a significant portion of her former colleagues fell into. 18 months inside, a corrupt operation, feeding information out, managing the flow of what got discovered and when. It was not clean work. There was no version of it that was clean. But it had bought time, and the time had mattered, and she understood the choice, even if she would not have made it herself. She asked Quinlan to pass along a message. A simple one, well done. Some rest. Quinlan relayed it. The reply which Quinlan read to her over the phone was, "You too. You were always better at the documentation than me." Actually laughed, briefly and without self-consciousness, and Quinlan sounded mildly startled, and then the conversation moved on to procedural matters, and that was fine. In the 8th week, Claire Ashford called. 4th hospital, she said. The staff member whose flag was suppressed 18 months ago. We found her name is Ren Castanis. She was a pharmacist in Baton Rouge. She's willing to provide a supporting statement. A pause. She was let go under circumstances very similar to yours, except there was no federal investigation waiting in the wings. She spent 8 months unemployed. A falsified performance record followed her through the hiring process. Lena sat down. She was in the break room. The IV pump in Bay 4, the repaired one, was humming correctly in the background through the open door. Is she all right? Asked. She's employed again. It took her 8 months, as I said. She has. Ashford paused, which was unusual for her. She has a lot of feelings about the past 18 months. Some of them are directed at the system that failed her. Some of them are directed at the specific people who failed her. And apparently a few of them, positive ones, are directed at you specifically, because your testimony is what opened the door that led us to her case. Lena pressed her hand flat on the table, the same way she had pressed it the morning after everything, trying to stop the shaking. This time her hands were steady. Can I speak with her? Lena asked. I'll arrange it. She spoke with Ren Castanis the following Tuesday. 40 minutes on the phone in the parking lot during her lunch break, sitting on the trunk of her car in the afternoon light. Castanis had a voice that was direct and tired, and occasionally funny in a dry, self-aware way that Lena recognized as the voice of someone who had processed a very bad experience extensively enough to have developed perspective on it. She had been a careful pharmacist who had noticed what Lena had noticed at a different hospital in a different state, and had tried to do the right thing and had been punished for it with a thoroughness that had taken 18 months to partially recover from. I keep thinking, Castanis said at one point, about what would have happened if I'd just let it go. Account that didn't add up. I looked at it, and I thought, that's not right. I could have just moved on. But you didn't, Lena said. A pause. Neither did you. No. Do you think it was worth it? All of it, what it cost. Lena looked at the hospital building across the lot, the ordinary brick face, the signage, the staff entrance where she came in every morning and left every night. The building where a patient named Castanis had been failed, and a pharmacist in Baton Rouge had been failed. And where some other careful person at some other facility would have been failed if a pharmaceutical transit case had made it out of a loading dock on a Tuesday morning. I think the cost was real, she said. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But yes, I think it was worth it. Castanis was quiet for a moment. I think so too. I just needed to hear someone else say it. The formal hearing on Lena's service record. The proceeding that Claire Ashford had told her was unavoidable. That would make the classified content part of the federal record happened in the 10th week. It was not public. It was conducted in a federal building in Charleston in a room with no windows and 3 attorneys and 2 federal officials and Lena and a court reporter. It lasted 4 hours. Her service history was entered into the record completely. Classified designations noted and sealed within the case record rather than publicly accessible, but present. She had spent 3 years keeping that record buried. She had had reasons. The reasons had seemed good at the time, and she did not entirely regret them because the choice to build an ordinary life had been a genuine choice, not a failure of nerve. He had needed what the ordinary life gave her for a while. But the ordinary life had not fully taken. She had kept noticing things. She had kept caring about whether the counts were right, whether the systems were working, whether the patients were protected. But she had thought for 3 years that this was just how she was wired, the residue of training that didn't fully wash off. She understood now that it was something simpler and less dramatic than that. She cared. That was the whole thing. She had always cared. Eventually, had made the ordinary life untenable in the face of something genuinely wrong. The court reporter typed. The attorneys asked their questions. Lena answered. When it was done, the Ledve federal official, a man she had not met before and not meet again, looked at her over the table and said, with the measured affect of someone making an official statement, "For the record, the department acknowledges that the concerns you flagged 4 years ago in connection with the Kellner operation were valid, documented appropriately through your chain of command, and were improperly suppressed at the oversight level. Record reflects that correctly." She nodded. "Is there anything you want added to the record?" "What about it?" "Yes," she said. "I want it noted that Ren Castanis, the pharmacist at the 4th facility identified in the Harrow Supply Drive directory, flagged the same type of discrepancy 18 months ago and was let go under circumstances that have since been determined to involve fraudulent documentation. I want her record corrected as part of this proceeding to the extent that's within your authority." The official looked at his colleague, then back at Lena. "We can make a formal recommendation, please." The charges against everyone involved moved through the legal system at the pace legal systems move, which was sometimes exasperating, and was also, she understood, the point slow because it was supposed to be thorough, because the alternative was faster and worse. Away. Entered a plea in the 14th week, Pratt in the 15th. Contested everything which was expected given the scale of what he was facing, and his case moved into a timeline measured in months rather than weeks. She followed it without obsessing over it. There were patients. There was always work. The oversight contact who had been named as a co-conspirator in the Drive communications resigned his federal position in the 12th week. He was charged in the 16th. The field supervisor who had communicated with Vore pleaded guilty in the 13th week and cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence cooperation that provided several additional threads that Ashford's team followed into the broader contractor network. The full network, it turned out, was larger than even the Drive contents had suggested. Had been a partial archive. What the cooperation opened up was a more complete picture, and the more complete picture was the kind of thing that generated significant congressional attention, and a long federal register of formal findings and a review of the hospital modernization grant program that had been Harrow Supply's primary entry mechanism. Review resulted in new oversight requirements. The new requirements were imperfect, as new requirements always were, but they were something. Marcus Riley resurfaced in the 12th week in a brief phone call through Quinlan. His voice was rougher than she remembered, and he said very little, and she said very little back, and at the end of the call he said, "You built the case. I just made sure you had time to build it. You did more than that," she said. Maybe, he said, doesn't change how it felt. She understood that. Hospital's oversight board formally cleared Lena of all accusations in the 16th week. The clearance was complete, specific, and documented. The controlled substance charge withdrawn. The planted evidence traced conclusively to Pratt through locker room camera footage that Lena had insisted be preserved on the first morning. The manipulation of the medication log system's access records attributed to a remote modification Pratt had made using Calloway's administrative credentials. The interim director called her into the administrative wing, a different office than Calloway's, which was sealed pending the legal proceedings, and handed her a formal letter on hospital stationery. Acknowledged that Lena Marsh had been subjected to false accusations, an improper arrest, and professional harm through deliberate misconduct by hospital administration and its contracted agents. It formally stated that her professional record at Mercy Hollow General contained no findings of wrongdoing, and that the events of the relevant date would be expunged from her employment file. It was signed by Drummond, by the Oversight Board Chair, and by 2 members of the State Health Department. Lena read it twice, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket. "There's something else," Drummond said. Lena looked up. The Oversight Board, in consultation with the State Health Department and the hospital's medical staff leadership, has proposed the creation of a new program, a permanent position. Drummond slid another document across the desk. Emergency response and institutional compliance coordination. The mandate is to run training for crisis and mass CALDI scenarios, but also to conduct independent medication management audits ongoing, with direct reporting authority to the Oversight Board, rather than hospital administration. Lena looked at the document. The mandate includes the authority to refer concerns directly to state and federal oversight bodies without administrative approval, Drummond said. The position was designed specifically so that what happened here cannot happen again. At least not in the same way for the same reason. She paused. The board would like to offer it to you. Lena set the document down. She looked at the table for a moment, not at Drummond, just at the surface of the table, the ordinary grain of it, the unremarkable institutional furniture of a job she had chosen, because she needed something ordinary and had discovered that ordinary was not in the end a thing she was built for. I'm not a compliance officer, she said. No, Drummond agreed. You're something more useful. You're someone who noticed a problem, understood its structure, documented it carefully, and held it together through circumstances that most people wouldn't have survived professionally. She held Lena's gaze. You don't have to be a compliance officer. You just have to be what you already are. Lena thought about the medication count that had started all of this. The small number that hadn't added up on an unremarkable Tuesday. That she had looked at and thought, that's not right. She thought about Ren Castanis, who had seen the same number in a different hospital in a different state and made the same call and paid a much higher price for it. She thought about patients who moved through systems that were supposed to protect them, and sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on whether anyone was paying attention. She thought about who she was when she wasn't trying to be someone smaller. Yes, she said, I'll take it the weeks after that were still complicated, because complications don't end by resolution. Case. The ground forward through the federal system. The congressional attention-generated hearings and then reports, and then eventually a narrowly written piece of legislation that tightened the auditing requirements for federally funded hospital contractor programs. Lena read the legislation when it passed. It was imperfect, and it was something in Castanis's record was formally corrected in the 19th week. Ushered, called to tell her, and Lena was between patients, and she stepped into the corridor and stood there for a moment after the call ended and let it matter. Marcus Riley resurfaced again in the 23rd week, not by phone but in person, sitting in the waiting area of Mercy Hollow General's ER, which she had not expected. He was thinner than she remembered, with the look of someone who had been through a sustained period of very difficult work and was on the other side of it but hadn't slept adequately yet. He stood when she came through the door. You didn't have to come in person, she said. I was in the area, he said, which was almost certainly not true. And I wanted to see that you were. He started again. You look better than I expected. You look worse than I expected. Fair, he said. They stood in the waiting area of an emergency room, which was not a comfortable place to stand and have a conversation, and neither of them particularly noticed that she had spent 3 years trying to build an ordinary life and discovering that ordinary was a surface and not a substance. He had spent 14 months doing work that required him to be someone he wasn't for a reason he believed in at a cost that was visible now in the lines around his eyes. Are you all right? She asked. The same question Quillen had asked her on the morning of everything, with the same meaning. Not asking for a performance, asking for an answer. Working on it, he said. You working on it, she said. He nodded. They stood there another moment in the way of people who understand each other well enough, not to need the conversation to be comfortable to be real. What happens now, he asked. Now I run the program, she said. I do the audits. And when someone finds a number that doesn't add up, they bring it to me instead of being alone with it. That's a good answer. It's a real answer, she said. I'm not sure it's good yet. I'll know in a few years. He looked around the ER, the ordinary machinery of it, the monitors, the staff moving with purpose, the controlled busyness of a place that dealt with crises as a matter of daily function. You really like it here, he said. I really like she said. That's not the same thing, but it's enough. There was no ceremony. She had declined one explicitly through Drummond and through Ashford, and they had both accepted this without argument, which she appreciated. The things that had happened in front of a lot of people. The arrest had been public. The evacuation had been public. And enough of the subsequent investigation had become public through coverage and court filings that the basic shape of it was accessible to anyone who cared to look. She didn't need a room full of people to confirm that what she had done was real. She knew what it had cost and what it had changed and what it had not been able to fix. The months when Castanets had spent unemployed could not be returned. And the patients whose medications had been diverted could not have those specific harms undone. And the field supervisor who had shared federal investigation information with a target was going to pay a legal price that was appropriate and was still not equivalent to what his choices had enabled. The world didn't resolve neatly. She had never expected it to. Did was move, and the movement was the thing you worked with. The imperfect forward, grinding movement of systems trying to correct themselves when people inside them insisted on accuracy. She was one of those people. It was not a comfortable thing to be. It never had been, and it was not going to become comfortable with time. She was all right with that on a Thursday morning in the 6th month after everything. Lena Marsh came through the south entrance of Mercy Hollow General Hospital at 7:45. She nodded to the security officer at the desk, a new one hired through a process that now included a conflict of interest screening that hadn't previously existed. She walked through the corridor that connected to the administrative wing and then turned down the main hallway toward the ER floor. She had her own office now, which was small and had one window that faced the parking structure and a desk that held a computer and a stack of audit reports and a notepad she had already filled 3/4 of the way through in the first 6 months. The new program was 4 months operational. She had run 6 training scenarios, 2 live incidents, and had initiated 3 independent medication audits, one of which had already been referred to the State Pharmaceutical Oversight Board. Because there was another Harrow supply, there wasn't. Not here, not yet. But because a number hadn't added up, and it was her job to say so. She dropped her bag in the office and pulled on her clinical jacket. She had 2 morning meetings, one with the Oversight Board's audit liaison, one with Drummond on the new incident reporting protocol she'd been drafting, and then she was on the floor for the afternoon. She paused at the office door. On the wall next to the door, Tomas had taped something up 3 months ago without telling her he was going to. Printout of the State Health Department's formal commendation letter, which she had not asked for and had not requested be displayed anywhere. She had taken it down twice. He had put it back up twice. She had, on the 3rd removal, held it in her hands for a moment and thought about Ren Castanis and about the unnamed staff member at the other locations who had noticed and been silenced before anyone could hear them, about Marcus Riley, sitting in the ER waiting room, looking like a man who had given a significant portion of himself to something he believed in and was trying to figure out what was left. She had taped it back up herself. She looked at it now for exactly 1 moment, the formal language of official recognition, the signatures at the bottom, the unadorned declaration that the work had been real and the person who had done it had been seen, and then she turned away from it and walked out the door and down the corridor toward the floor where the patients were. The things that had been done to her had been real. The people who had done them had faced real consequences, charges, the particular and unglamorous weight of accountability that moved slowly and arrived fully. The life she had tried to build had not survived intact, and the life she was building now was more complicated and more exposed and more demanding than the quiet one she had chosen 3 years ago. It was also more true. She had not stopped a criminal network because she was extraordinary. She had stopped it because she was paying attention, and she refused to stop paying attention. And when they tried to take the ability to pay attention away from her, she didn't let them. That was the whole of it. The training helped, and the history helped, and the skills she had spent years, pretending she didn't have been useful at specific moments. The foundation of all of it was simpler and older, and more available to more people than any specialized skill. She had seen something wrong, and she had not looked away. The people who underestimated her had underestimated that. They had looked at a small woman who kept her head down and spoke quietly and asked procedural questions and stayed late to fix the IV pump herself. And they had put her in the category of someone who would accept what was given to her and be grateful for the acceptance. She had never been in that category. She had simply been patient. The south corridor opened into the floor, and the morning shift was in motion, and Tomas was at the nursing station with a chart and a cup of bad coffee, and the expression of someone who had 8 things to manage and was managing them. He looked up when she came through. Morning, he said. Fine, she said. What have we got? He handed her the chart. She read it as she moved toward Bay 1. There was work to do.